I'm interested. Speaking of like, British versus not, like when does Walpurgisnacht? I didn't do much research on that in the end. When does that become like such a standard feature of Europistani craft? Do you know what I mean?
um, early modern period.
Yeah.
I can tell. Which coincides with witches in general, right? Like, because we're not
For
in
sure.
the people there, and she's still the church is still a thing, but the ideas of the mountain and how it happens is going to be popularized during the witch trials themselves, all around the same time, from what I understand, the going to Brocken. But of course, it's Goethe that popularizes it past anything.
There we go. That's probably where it starts. Yeah.
So,
Not to be too like, oh, let's focus on the figure of the witch, rather than actual witches, or witchcraft or witch trials or the worry about them.
the side that fascinates me is we're not celebrating her death day. We're celebrating the moving of her relics to a new place. So it's literally tied into night flight. It's tied into the moving of bones, the uprooting of something and taking them somewhere else. So that parallels the Sabbath journey to me very strongly.
Right.
So there is a thing of celebrating the translation of relics, which is translation is just when it moves from one center to another.
Yeah. The tourist board puts extra money in.
Yeah. So the witchcraft side of it is the folk traditions that are it's hard to date when folk traditions start, but certainly by the 16th, 17th centuries, we have fantastical descriptions of things going on, for oily bones and everything. It doesn't. We can even compare some of the things with our saint of the day. So I guess, at that point, hi, welcome to Radio Free Golgotha.
Hello.
If you don't know what you're here for, neither do we. So it's been a while since we've done one. Our last one was in November, which hopefully will be. Hopefully you've listened to it at some point in the ether. But we are celebrating the quarantine feast day of Catherine of Siena, who is April 29th and 30th, depending on how traditional pre-Vatican II you are, or in that constellation. So, welcome to Radio Free Golgotha. I'm Jesse. This is Al.
I'm Al.
And we do this thing, supposedly. So welcome to Quarantined RFG. Al and I are very well social distanced by hundreds of miles. Even more so than just the boroughs between us of usual. But today is Catherine of Siena focus. We are going to focus on Ashtaroth, and may introduce a side of the king and the queen of the Seven Crossroads, who are the kind of syncretisms with Ashtaroth and Astarte from a Cumana perspective. What else are we dealing with, Al?
Oh, we're going to be chatting about Mandrake, seen as it's a Walpurga influence. We've gone a little bit witchier than usual, which I'm very excited about. So we're going to be talking about Mandrake, and this episode also brought to you by the type of magic : night flight. Sorry, that's not : night flight. That would probably be a bit late. I was meant to be a meaningful pause. Brought to you by the kind of magic night flight. And also by the tarot card, the Moon, and by the geomantic figure of Albus, which I believe shares its formation with Oturupon. Am I saying that right?
Oturupon Meji, and then Marulna in Dilagun.
And also, magician of the episode is Isobel Gowdie. So I'm very excited to talk about some Scottish witchcraft as well.
Some finagling to get Al to be okay with that. Did we mention Quartz? Quartz is coming in too.
Oh, I didn't. I missed that one. Yes, and Quartz.
It's great because we decided that Quartz gets forgotten about and kind of shunned. So I'm glad that it was almost forgotten about in our intro to vindicate it later. the
I
wonderful
was,
people that is
yeah,
Quartz.
it was performative pedagogy, clearly.
Yes, absolutely. Everything's performative pedagogy in retrospect.
You learn more from a monster than a teacher.
So, where do you want to start? I'm assuming with the saint in that way.
Yeah, let's get sainted up. I feel like Catherine of Siena is, someone that you don't speak of a lot, but speak of quite fondly when you do. And she seems.
The British you or the actual you?
Oh, I meant you.
Oh, you like me, the sheep. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ram Jesse. Yes.
Yes. No. Both Catherines are phenomenal, right?
Right, and that's not a bad start. That's the first thing I noted down is that I started reading the Golden Legend and was like, I don't think this is Siena, and it's not. It's Alexandria. So, we're back to our familiar issue of hagiographic blur, especially when they share the same damn name. So again, usual provisos. Catherine of Siena is not Catherine of Alexandria, except when the things that she does in her stories are because of that hagiographic blur. Except when they're not. Except when they are.
Yes, and the conflation happens anyway. And there's even one of the depictions of the sacred marriage depicts them both taking their vows with Mary and baby Jesus.
Right, and I kind of like that, and I think it adds a layer of like considering, the Catherines, that's a way of saying yes, they share some features, they're also distinct, but look at them, they both married Jebus.
Yeah. I think Catherine of Alexandria is her own fascinating subject, and obviously there's things that are going to come in with Catherine of Siena. Alexandria is the Catherine wheel Catherine. She's a martyr, as opposed to Catherine of Siena, who is wholly anorexic, invisible stigmata, and doctor of the church, one of the patron saints of Europe, which is fascinating too, because there were the two female doctors of the church that were the first two. She's the second, right on the tails of Teresa of Avila, each other. So there's this extreme call to have mystic women with visions and pseudo-orgasmic revelations to be the first female named doctors of the church, named female doctors of the church.
Huh. Do you think that's a carryover of the old men are brain smart and women are body smart?
It might be in their popular devotion, but they weren't made doctors until 1970.
Yeah.
I don't think that during that kind of, I think the call to honor women in the church as doctors was its own, perhaps product of post-Vatican II and a call to a different social awareness by the church. But I don't, I think her popular, the fact that her feast day changed is because of her cult being so popular. She died on the 29th of April in a Jesus year, 33. And because of the devotion to an already popular saint, they didn't want to compete, so they moved her feast day to one day later to April 30th.
Right.
And with the reassignment and the reevaluation of the calendar, that cult that had displaced her feast day was nowhere near as popular. It was only popular in that local area, whereas Catherine of Siena was now incredibly loved by the church. She's depicted in third order robes with a crown of thorns very often. She is a mystic.
Oh, really? With a crown of thorns as well?
Oh, yeah, she's a stigmatic. But her stigmata is only for her to see. That was her request of God. So she received the stigmata, but it wasn't something other people saw, which is interesting too.
Huh. So what are the records of that? Not what are the records, like tell me the name of the manuscript or something, but like...
Oh, it's very clear. It's her biography talks about it, which was done by a priest who records it. And there's the visions that she has throughout the various things from an early age that all are contained in her biography.
Yes. Is it Raymond, her confessor? Yeah, he takes a bunch of those records, doesn't he? It's a hell of a promotion she goes through, right? From, not only the doctor of the church thing, but also moving from a patron of Rome to Italy, to the whole of Italy, to the whole of Europe.
Yes. And she shares her patronage, but still it's This is not a nun. Let's be clear. We look at her artwork depictions. This is a laywoman. She's third order.
Right, the Dominicans, right?
Well, Dominicans have first and second order too. It's just that third order means layperson. Second order is nun. First order is friar. So, like St. Francis started all three. So, if you're a layperson in the third order, it means that you're not living in an abbey or behind cloistered walls or anything like this. She kind of defies her parents. So she has these visions from an early age, and she wants to dedicate her life to God. They don't like this. She's also a twin with a dead twin at that, which of course stands out right there, right? So there's something interesting in that, and that speaks to Oturupon Meji as well, interestingly. But her mother, by the time she had like 22 children by the time she'd had Catherine, and like 25 children all in all. Half of them had died,
of course.
And I mean that's a lot of children.
Yeah.
And the idea that she did what many of the early martyrs did in kind of this protest of being married off, because the family was trying to secure their wealth and their status, and her older sister died, and they were going to marry her to the widow.
Yes, right. And here's one of the crossovers with, because Catherine of Alexandria is also a faster as well, right? Does a lot of the and for the same reasons, right? That again, she wants to marry the church / God / Jesus, and the folks want her secured off, and so she does it to protest, right? And I read some note about the sister's widower not having treated the sister terribly well, supposedly, but that the fasting starts to like make him see that this isn't a joke. Yeah, and it's her. I mean, she's kind of bratty about it. I mean, it's fantastic, her brattiness, because she uses it all as weapons for her spirituality, right? So she becomes a third order religious person, meaning she lives at home. She right.
Dress like a nun, but live at home. And she was famous for giving her parents stuff away without their permission. And it caused a lot of problems, because every time there was a fight, I mean, this is the lore around it, right? That any time that she needed to get special messages across to people, it's like, oops, sorry, sold your bed. Someone needed it. I gave the alms to the poor and the bed to wherever. Yeah. So she has this reputation in that way. Also, that she kind of does that spouse yoga, and like it's someone please correct me, but I know that there's the bhakti devotion to a deity, but there's that form of finding God through serving your spouse, for instance. She does this, of course, because she's married to Jesus, but she immediately envisions her mother as the Virgin Mary, her father as Joseph, and her brothers as the apostles. Yes. She does serving the home by making them, in her mind, the ideal version of what they should be. And therefore it brings her closer to God constantly, because she's treating every interaction with everybody around her as if she's a character in the Gospels. Right. She's living that life intimately. I also really, really enjoy, with the mystic marriage, her foreskin passage is just like, it's an interesting, weird visual to bring up. I think it gets kind of overemphasized. At the same time, I can tell why. It's just, but the idea that she compares the foreskin that's chopped off of baby Jesus as the perfect size as a wedding band. Yeah. I was wondering how this one was going to go, in terms of also not wanting to feel like I'm 13 in my religious education class again at the back sniggering, and that you were going to put forward a lot of like beautiful tenets of her mysticism, and I was going to be like, but talk about the foreskin. But no, yeah, you're quite right. A beautiful motif. What is it? One biographer said like a fusion with Christ's physicality. Yes, well, definitely the divine marriages of many of the holy anorexics, Teresa of Avila included, that there is it's a corporeal union with God in this lifetime. Right. Because they're also only eating the Eucharist as their nourishment.
Yeah. The lack of the fact that it isn't, some typical pushy heathen husband who has her put to death for not doing what he wants, but rather seems to be her just taking the fasting incredibly seriously, eventually describing her inability to eat as an illness, right?
Well, especially on her deathbed, that like as she started going towards it, because she lost the use of her legs in the last days of her life, and
It's the last like month, right? That's the end of February. It was claimed, I think. Yeah. So she's existing off the Holy Eucharist and pretty much nothing else.
Her life is going really, really. I mean, really, really hard. like many people's this year.
She's overachieving Lent.
Yeah. And also, I saw you in your preparatory research. Her tendency, which I think is tied into, in many ways, her way of personalizing or projecting, familiarizing the gospel stories through projecting them upon the people she's in contact with. So calling the Pope Daddy,
right,
is its
her sweet baboon.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, that's also not like, I don't know. I think it's worth pointing out that like Il Papa also means like dad anyway, right? It's not it's perhaps not as like what's the word I'm looking
slightly
for?
affectionized form that she uses.
Yeah.
As opposed to a formal tone. But there's arguments of this even, right, that Abun in Aramaic, that Jesus himself is calling Father God Daddy and not a formal word Father.
Right.
The Our Father is put into the familiar. It's thou. It's not in.
Oh yeah.
Which is an important marker. There's a familiarity with God, an intimate connection to God that anybody can use. The informal with God, that it's not supposed to be. Now we, by contrast, in the modern era, we use thou. It seems too formal, right?
Right.
It's ironic.
It's what a lot of folk singers from the north of Europe, from the north of England, get accused of as being like overly folksy for using like thee and thou when, like, people in Barnsley use that when you're at the shops, buying milk. Like it's not it's not affectatious actually. It's just that people keep haven't stopped talking like that.
Yeah. I think I was 16 or 17 the first time I heard Hannah the Dun. It's just like, oh, how am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I understood what they were asking. It's kind of like, I use howdy a lot, and people immediately ask, "Oh, I'm doing fine." I was like, "Is that what I was asking?" I mean, I guess that's the origin of the word.
Howdy, yeah.
But
I think the familiarity with the Pope is interesting because it's not just like fangirl letters. She's actually has this, like, it seems, this very close and somewhat unusual relationship with the Pope in terms of
papacy. Right. This is the Western Schism is happening.
Right.
So there's the Avignon papacy, and you can't even tell which pope is which for a little bit. And just the misplacement of the papacy because of politics, and then the French crown being like, no, we're the seat of the Holy Roman Empire now, which is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. That's
but they did have lovely knights.
Yes. But yeah, she's a fantastic figure. I enjoy that her feast day is at the end of April, and there's kind of this, there has to be a convergence with this kind of Walpurgisnacht lore, even though she's not named as such, but the time of year is going that way either way. But it's still, the land has woken up. Something is different now in the European temperate climates. So I think there's something to it. It's also worthy to note that she's Tuscan. And the lore of witchcraft that comes out of Tuscany is its own interesting side of that. Siena is in Tuscany. But yeah, so the intimate connections with who is it? Saint Anthony, I believe, right? Is the she was made a doctor with Teresa of Avila. She was buried in the Isis church, right? So Maria Sopra Minerva, even though it's called Minerva, but it's an Isis church. It's near the Pantheon. So she's laid to rest there. They take her head back to Siena and a thumb which is put in a nice bust, kind of like the Mary Magdalene figure. So her body is there in Maria Sopra Minerva, but the head is in Siena.
The taking of the thumb is one of those, like, the thumb is the primus inter pares of the fingers, right? Because it's what allows you to actually grasp.
I mean, I like it.
Right?
Feel like we must take a digit back with us so that
Of course
her body is, that she can thumb through the pages, and then I have these weird visions of, like, is she licking her thumb and, like, taking the makeup off of your face, or, like, off of your beard. Yeah. But it's Peter of Verona. That's whose feast day she interfered with her death. She died on a convenient day, and then they moved it back.
The fact that, we've probably heard of Catherine of Siena more times than we've heard of Peter. That particular Peter, anyway, is self-testament, right?
And it is Francis of Assisi. I'm sorry, I said Saint Anthony, but it's Francis of Assisi is the co-saint of Italy.
Yeah. And
then it's Bridget, and not Teresa of Avila, but some other Teresa. Teresa Benedicta, I think. Bridget of Sweden is the other two patrons of Europe. Ladies, a little trio of ladies. A little Mandrake there, stuff going on. But,
yeah, I mean, that has to, I think you can only understand that in terms of, like, a bunch of political contexts, right? There's no one crying out for, like, theologically that there has to be these patron saints of Europe, right?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too that, like, the Catherine of Alexandria, like, conflation that happens, that's not even in the record until right before Catherine of Siena is born. It's like within a decade of her birth, we find the first account of the mystical marriage of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. If there's no record of it being the part of the cultic practice before then, so it's already playing on something in the 14th century and the kind of rise of the Golden Legend and the story that's going on there. But definitely there's some tie-ins there. The mystical marriage is always an interesting side of it in general, right? It's like a bridegroom waiting for the bride on the wedding night, constant thing going on. Maybe it's a bride waiting for the bridegroom. Did I reverse that? Genderless bride. Let's just everybody be a bride. It'll be easier. It's the reception of something going on there.
Right.
I also really love that she, again, that third order thing. I just, it's kind of like the LARPing of religious life. You get to dress the part. You're still technically religious, but you're not clergy.
Right.
And there's a public ceremony, there's public affirmations, but you're not held to the vows of, like, living within a community in the same way. Community is spread out. So there's definitely this thing that's very, like, defiant, right? 16 years old, and she's like, screw this. I don't want to marry my dead sister's husband.
Run away and join the church.
Yeah, and the rest of the third
church
order said, no, she's not a widow. So it's funny in some ways. They wanted to pull the Saint Rita route first of like, no, go live a horrible life and then you can become and you haven't suffered enough,
right?
And she's like, you don't know how much I've starved myself. I'll show you. And I don't know, just she's a very interesting saint because of this, the stigmatic side of it, dressed in religious robes, even though she's not second order. She foreshadows in many ways Saint Rose of Lima, who is another one of the mystical marriage saints, but far later. That's early 17th century. I think just the emphasis there, I kind of breezed past it, but the lore that would be attached to someone being a twin whose twin has died within the Afrodiasporic context, this means that twin is going to call to that person to join them on the other side consistently throughout their life, and that they must in turn, and it was a sister, it was I don't know if it was identical or fraternal, because oftentimes those words weren't even mentioned yet.
Right.
They're born at the same time as all that was, really the Latin or the Greek. but that it's interesting that she then is in a spiritual marriage to a child, right? So this parallel to me there of the Abeji cult, of having to carry around an image with you constantly. Well, she does. She dedicates her life to Jesus, which, okay, fine, is an adult man nailed to a cross, which she received at Stigmata, but it becomes a substitute sibling in many ways. That the image of her before Mary with Jesus on Mary's lap that is so common in the art is almost like a substitute twin. There's this immediate loss this vacancy that metaphysically in many traditions would be put there because there's a dead twin. And that's fascinating to me. And even in the depiction when it's not as common, but it's when she's depicted with Catherine of Alexandria, again, this constant twinning of things, the symmetry that goes through that. One twin dead, one twin alive, one twin, the baby Jesus as the substitute twin. Which twins are a big part of Bomeji. I think also just in emphasizing the kind of translation of relics there, that the translation of the relics of the head and the thumb to Siena does parallel even Walpurga's kind of, let's make a big feast day out of it, because Siena becomes her, a home base for her worship. And that's her differentiation from Catherine of Alexandria. Joyous child who became an anorexic for Jesus.
Right. And thus had plenty of time to write when she wasn't eating. And
dictate as well. She was someone grab a pen saint and would dictate to them. She did. It was the religious life that taught her how to read, which is common across the board, right? If you're precocious, you would be like, I'm going to go join an order because I want to know what that book says.
Right.
But yeah. I'm sure we'll touch on a couple of things, but translation does really speak to me of Night Flight. There's certainly, even if the little baby Jesus, the mystical marriage, the foreskin of Jesus, had made me start thinking about like Mandrake lore and the mannequin, and the idea of the Virgin Mary presenting baby Jesus to be married to him and having this kind of wedding night relationship. Speaks of the illusions of the moon and the romanticism of the moon, and certainly the ability to have visions where your body is in one place but you are seeing something that is not there. Again, moon card, but also Night Flight, and even as we chose Isobel Gowdie there's something there too, that the choice to see things. Gaudie's huge marker is that those were not tortured confessions according to the record.
Right.
It said, by the way, I've been with the devil and I've turned into a hare and I have a coven, which is a very different thing, and sets the ball rolling for a lot of what is romanticized about especially neo-pagan witchcraft because of Murrayist incorporation of Gaudie's confessions into proving that there was a pervasive secret underground cult, which then you can make the square pegs fit the round holes pretty convincingly if it's a cheese grater.
Right.
So that's its own thing. But the one that I didn't see it as much of a connection immediately to was Ashtaroth. I could stretch it and be like, well, I guess if we can include Catherine of Alexandria and it's the wheel that like the Ponto Hiscalo, the Queen of the Seven Crossroads, is kind of, but that was me searching for something. But the one that's hardest for me to connect it to, because quartz crystals is the thumb. I was trying to figure out, as I'm reading this, like, oh, that makes me think of these other things that I know we're going to talk about.
The quartz makes you think of the thumb?
Yeah. Because it's like, literally, I don't know. Am I the only person that has a bunch of quartz pieces that are the size of a thumb?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, the crystals.
I'm from California. Quartz was a big part of the 90s.
I like that you made a point. Yeah, let's get into quartz then. I like that you made the point that like it can feel like the kind of not exactly the redheaded stepchild, but like the vanilla awaiting a flavor of color or something. That like it gets kind of it doesn't get its own praises sung enough. Yeah. Has to be like a version of itself.
It epitomizes New Ageism in that way of like wearing quartz to help focus your desire and your will and manifest things. And I don't want to dwell on New Ageism as an overly negative thing. It does describe a certain mentality,
Sure.
but that quartz has been used consistently, I mean, throughout history, yes, but it is a quintessential stone, especially, I mean, early modern and colonial and empire-based magic. Quartz is a thing.
Right.
You know, it is one of the most easily recognizable stones, and its clearness, its clarity is magical. That side of it, that it's not just like, okay, it's not something that you would have to surrender to the king in that way. It's like, it's not an emerald or a ruby or something like this. It doesn't have to be. It forms naturally in impressive crystals, as opposed to having to be faceted into something that would then be put in a ring. And that side of it, capturing spirits in quartz, totally a thing.
Right.
You know, I mean, it doesn't always have to be glued and sculpted with Fimo or Sculpey onto the edge of a Gandalf staff.
I mean, you know, gets
or
to be.
In how many head shops do you see like the same Fimo things with like little glass cabochons and a pretty big old quartz crystal hanging down on some rope that's going to smell like armpit and, you know, teenage beer sweat.
And patchouli, please. Let's be fair. No, it's cool to look at it as a kind of like crystal of like, oh, you're into crystals. What do crystals do? They do what quartz does. Quartz does what crystals do. If that's not too much of a
go on, that's great. I like that, but like, expand.
Like it's the root, as far as we can tell, is the Germanic quartz, which is from a Polish term, which is from a Czech term, for its hardness. By the time we get to it being likened to an older term, the Greeks have it as, it's crystallos, right? It's called krustallos, from krus, meaning ice or icy cold. And so Pliny the Elder talks about quartz being very old ice that was permanently frozen after great lengths of time. Although, interestingly, the Irish word, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, is translated as sunstone. So we've got two angles on like, oh, look at this like very clear stone. Does it reflect the light of the sun, or does it reflect the hardness and the coldness of ice and water and the cold? So that, I think, is already a great start for just like how it covers a multitude of things. I mean, in terms of its technicality, right? So many things are quartzes, right? That we wouldn't call, not just, you know, the things that are flavored, if we want to put it like that, like rose quartz or smoky quartz, but also like all agates are technically quartzes, which is like not just agate, but there's therefore also like bloodstone, carnelian, all onyx. Right. All the chalcedonies. Also amethyst, and therefore
citrine, you know.
Yeah. And then looking at its like, I don't know, it's very easy to look at crystal books and feel like everything does everything. And there's a kind of like, you feel, you know, I often feel a little bit like cold read by the book about this stuff. But, you know, notions
backed by a pre-written book.
Right. Notions of clarification and retention, right? That on the one hand, it's for, quote, clearing away negative energy, or, quote, dispelling negativity, right? It clarifies, it purifies, it brings clarity. Then there's that notion more specifically that might cover countering or protecting from deliberate negative energy of maleficia. But then that other aspect of like the concentration and retainment that's necessary to structure, to store, to amplify and focus, as well as transmit and transform energy, intent, information that's like loaded into it. These seem like, it seems like it's useful to talk about quartz before you get to any other stone, right?
Yes. And certainly, I mean, there's the lore going around it too, because it's so obviously six-sided in its determination. It's often twinned. Connects it to Catherine there. But that the sixth side of it there means that it is an embodiment of the Sabbath, because it's the cube. It's the days of creation. If we want to go, I'm a cube. I mean the cube of space there reference, but that God is in the center of every quartz crystal in some way, resting, because the sides have been suggested there. So 6 evokes, yes, the Mogan David, the Star of David, but also just as a perfection of creation. In that way, it feels. It is one of the easiest things to tell someone or suggest to them or have them experience a vibratory thing, a pretty formed quartz crystal, because of its shape, of the prismatic quality of it. And I think that, there are times like that for me, like, Moldavite is one of the ones that is like the gimmick one of like, put this in the hand. Does your hand go numb? And like, for many people's it does. Waterfall pounded rocks feel like they're vibrating in a different way than other rocks. Quartz is consistently one of those ones that I think people is the like basic, and the books of the 90s would suggest you start off with a simple kind of exercise in talking to a crystal as a person, notions of personhood and through animistic tendencies and worldview. Because it is also the granddaddy, it is the Hagalas mother rune, right? When by the time you're getting into like the runic revivals of the 80s and 90s, but because of the 6-sided, so it becomes the seed rune for all the other runes to exist in, and it has this, and because Hagalas is hail, I mean, you can already see it there in that way. So it is the seed principle there. So just as the Star of David contains the elemental sigil forms of the triangles with the lines, and its totality is there as balance, that it also it in some way echoes the Hagel Mother rune, that it also echoes the cube of space in this amazing way. And then like you get to things like Ghost Quartz, right, where there's like one inside it still forming, and like that's just its own kind of craziness there.
I don't know, it just makes me think of like I don't know, meditations around the presence of absence, and like the fact that it doesn't have a particular like striking color to it, whether or not we're talking about like cloudier forms or clear forms, that it like it again to frame its kind of quote vanillaness, right, that there's a blank slate quality to it in some ways, or it certainly seems to be treated like that sometimes. In terms of like recording and things, I didn't realize that, was it piezoelectricity? That one of the early uses of this kind of conductivity of quartz crystals was in phonograph pickups. It's pretty cool. Like that the friction with a material object produces this electrical charge, I think. I mean, maybe physicists can correct me on that one. But that was pretty cool.
I'm not going to assert my lack of knowledge.
That wasn't a module in theatre school?
No.
Physics for poets.
No. I could dance quartz for you all day long, though.
Aww. You say the sweetest things.
Yeah. I do think there's some wonderful the idea of it being like whether it's opalized things or quartz crystals being used for weapons, like turned into weapons, certainly lends well to the Gandalf staff look in that way. Is it Grancloch? Is that what I'm saying? Is I'm trying to pronounce Gaelic for the first time?
The Sunstone, yeah. No, I'm not even going to try.
Grancloch. I'm making it sound more Scottish. Supposedly, I took 4 years of Irish Gaelic. But its connection to a mythical stone in Aboriginal mythology.
Oh yeah, I started reading that and was like, "What's the basis of this?" The Magan.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Mabane,
yeah,
Maban, just as a kind of an aura stone, a source stone. Which has its lore similarly in some of the folk uses in Cornwall, I believe, and different regions of your neck of the woods, of the land of your birth, not like where you are now. I don't know why there was a pseudo leprechaun accent on that. The land of your birth. but
It was endearing.
yeah, just that there's, you can store things in the crystal, right? Because it does look like you can trap things in it. It's a very different thing. The ideas of crystallography that started developing, which is what, like, it's I think it's actually 17th century.
Yeah, some of the very early stuff is looking at quartz specifically. Yeah, this is well before like people are growing it or anything. But yeah, no, it's earlier than I expected as well. And it's not till like, I mean, obviously like the most of the stuff isn't until the 18th and even 19th centuries. But yeah, people are consider it, you know, that the field was born, yeah, in the 17th century. Yeah, so there are very few hoops we have to jump through to make a direct connection between, you know, the art of drawing spirits into crystals and phonograph pickups and crystal oscillators.
Yeah.
The notion of it being clear is also interesting in terms of scrying stuff specifically. The standard line is to call one of those things a showstone, but the other word that's used very often is a beryl, and we seem to be using that as a generic term for stones. It doesn't refer to what we would call as technical beryl necessarily. And there are quite a few grimoires that say one of the main features of the stone should be, they mention its size sometimes, but the main thing they mention is that it should be as clear as possible usually. And that's often framed as like, you know, not having cracks in it or not having like blemishes, which again is very easy to see as, just as the seer and the operator must be purified, so must the medium by which spirits can come through, that a cracked or a disunified surface can produce the cracks are where the devil gets in, where doubt gets in, where lies get in, and the smoother or the least blemished as possible it can be, the more likely you are to get accurate, truthful, honest appraisal from the angels and spirits that you're.
No matter what you're doing, the crack is going to, or the chip is going to distort. And so you're either going to focus your attention there first, which means opportunistic things can learn that that's where you're going to go first.
Right.
Or if you have this thing, it's always going to distort the image to something that's untrue.
Right. And especially when we're talking about, like, to bang on about this again, the fact that, yes, there are some lovely elaborate ritual furnitures and cat's cradles for putting your stone in, but also a lot of, the records we have of 17th century practice show that people were taking their stones outside and putting it up to the sun and looking through it. So the capacities to magnify light and to dazzle ourselves through that thing, which seems to be the consistent feature of things being shiny or glimmering or glittering or any of those other lovely words.
Mm-hmm. And certainly prismatic, right? So there's something, if you hold it up to the sun, it's going to make a rainbow. It literally is dissecting light for you.
Right.
And you see things that you can't see with the naked eye.
Mm.
And that that it brings in that kind of ephemeralness of the rainbow and what that is in an interesting way. And the other thing that I remember reading was, because of the use in electronics by the 30s, that Brazil became the main source of quartz, which changes the whole political climate of an entire world dependent upon Brazil.
Right. Again, incredibly, as we were talking about the other night, incredibly resource-rich continent that receives none of the benefits of that. Who's the open veins of Latin America again?
Eduardo Galeano. Yeah.
Galeano. Yeah. Been very much enjoying reading a bit more of his stuff. Yeah, and of course that supply line is already interrupted right by World War II, right? Yeah.
And starting to grow, that everybody's like, we've got to figure out how to do this, without
paying the Brazilians. Yeah.
Yeah. So that we need our stones to magically do their own thing.
Right. So there's a German endeavor, right, that grows some of the first crystal quartz.
Mm-hmm. In speaking of that kind of prismatic quality, which is interesting, of holding it up to the sun and then something passes through, the light changes in some way, evokes the reflective quality of the moon, which is our card. And also still there's like a a churning in my gut of the mysteries of night flight tied into that. That a witch is someone who leaves her body. That the Sabbat is not a physical place, in the sense of it wasn't, your body was still at home, and this is recognized early on in the descriptions.
Oh yeah. All of that lovely cultus sabbati stuff about like about the trivia of sleep, wake, and dream being the root of the Sabbat. Like, I will kick myself. I've been doing a bunch of research on necromancy and related nigromancies, black magics. But I came across a early to mid 17th century account of the Sabbat, which is exactly that. Like it's not the people we study, the witches we study, and the people talking about witchcraft that we study in order to understand it for us, were not ignorant of these notions of what's going on.
Yeah,
the psychologization of it was already happening.
The apologetics were already there too.
Mm.
So when you go into the Perennial Witch trials with Delancre, and there were contemporary Jesuits who were like, you are deriving these under duress and based on popular notions, because then we can explore the origin of the witch's Sabbath through condemnation of and trying to land grab from Jews in southern Spain to then Cathars, and it becomes a movement that goes forward. Is one of the beautiful things, and we talked about this before too, I believe, on the show, but it was a great mention for Becky in her talk at the VGS on Hildegard. Why wasn't Hildegard burned as a witch or hung as a witch? Because it wasn't invented yet. There are notion of witchcraft. Of course, every culture has its access to what witchcraft is.
Right.
Evolution of it as a political crime, as this meeting the Sabbath and things like this. A lot of that still is lore that has yet to be developed as to what that is. So
right. You still have Maleficia. You may not have it as a political category. You still have the notion of like you can do harm with magic, but witch as a category beyond the very both general and specific wielder of Maleficia doesn't really, all of this stuff around night flight or any of these other feature witches marks or even rebaptism or any like inversion of good pious ritual, like all of that is a lot later. Like the coherence of it, each of those things, like the printing press, each of those moving parts was available well beforehand, but the putting them together under a single banner of the figure of the witch, is a lot later than our girl Hildegard.
And certainly, like why night flight? Like, okay, we have the reference to dream, obviously, so that there's this time, but the average person is spending their day laboring, making sure that there's food in a productive environment. So we can talk about the fireside magic of like spinning, so that there's just trance states that are accessible through spinning, which is a notorious thing. But you don't go into trance cooking the same way, because you're going to burn the food. Right. You might stare at the fire, but that's not the same thing. That's something we reserve for the elders that can afford to sit there and keep warm, and everybody else is moving around them in that way. Yeah. And certainly the idea even that the fireplace is the soot itself, the ingredients of the fireplace, which has all the fats and everything there, that this is such a prominent lore around the world, of course, because it's the heart, it's the heart of the home. But the soot itself becomes an ingredient in the ointments, which is its own magic we can talk about another time. But the concept of the ointment tied into night flight, the thing that launches you into this out-of-body experience, which is not quite the same. Night flight is more often spoken about by an ointment going onto the person than the person perhaps astrally projecting by choice. It's not, there is this, there are accounts of both, but especially now in the romanticism of it, it is tied into a choice to put the ointment on, or a request or a prescription to put the ointment on and meet at the Sabbath. Right. Is non-physical, that the people appear as if they're asleep while they're at the Sabbath.
They don't notice, or that there are accounts that sound like everyone is kind of sleepwalking in their own kind of private Sabbath to an extent.
Which then gets expanded upon that they've been replaced by a demon to make sure that everybody looks like they're still like good Christians in their beds.
Well, that's the aspect that interests me. Not that this other stuff doesn't, but like that's what I wanted to raise. And I don't want to sound too like I'm producing a political psychologized model, but the consistent refrain of men who don't know that their wives are doing this is kind of the focus of a lot of the, seems to be a focus of a lot of the demonologists and heresiographers and like witch trial and witchcraft writers, that, you know, this seems like a fundamental absurdism that's being emphasized by, you know, saying like, oh, they can't even tell that this is actually a broom, or this is actually what's it, the three-legged stool that's in the bed that they think is their wife. And there seems a kind of like cuckold adjacent worry here that like that the worst part of it is that it's going on under our noses and we don't know. Not to frame this, like to frame this outside of like what it means to be a witch and to do this stuff. Like what does night flight mean to someone who doesn't consider themselves a witch, but utterly believes in witchcraft?
And certainly the overlap with, you know, fairy lore and fairy abduction.
Right.
The changeling child there's still a child there. It's believed to be replaced with a fairy version or a demon version by whatever the expansion is there. But in a similar way, it appears there's something there and the real thing is somewhere else. The spirit of the thing is somewhere else, experiencing something different. And, you know, what it is to be a witch is its own, you know, lifetime of argument there in an interesting way. And I'm fascinated by the different groups that feel that they own that term as it is. Certainly the combating of the huge and it's a favorite word of mine, but the huge colonization of the rest of the world that Anglo-American use of the term witch has done, both in the complaint against the Christian, especially Protestant Christian traditions in America, with a memory of blaming Catholic Christian traditions for it. But there's this kind of oppressor to fight there. But then also the side of it of not recognizing that when you define it as this is the thing, that you're not going to incorporate what other cultures might think of their witches, that a witch is not always a human. And intrinsically tied to Western European concepts of witchcraft now, especially in the modern era, that a witch is a person, a human, not a spirit that is causing harm, whereas the term witch, as it's translated in other places, can very well mean something that is not human, a supernatural creature. Right. And, but the definition of a witch is somebody that a definition, let me make sure that article is in there. Yeah. A definition of a witch as a person who leaves their body. That concept of what night flight is fascinating to me, that it's a voluntary choice. Or at least, you know, your grandma takes you out of bed and smothers you with magic ointment, you go to the Sabbath with her, is its own thing. Or that if you see the women undressing by the fireplace, is it something about the fireplace, or is it the fact that it's warm? You know, the fact that we did the 2-part night sleep was so common still during this time period. I was going to say that too, that like there's an opportunity for you to witness this stuff as well. So it's not just who's sneaking around at night, it's also the period where a lot of people are sleeping for a certain period, then getting up at night and doing a bunch of things. So, and some people are starting a few chores, so it's not uncommon for your wife not to go back to bed with you. Right. Or your husband to not be, you know, there doesn't need to be this thing of like, let's go back upstairs, honey. You know, there may be like, oh, I'm just going to get this started for tomorrow. So the suspicions of what are they doing and who's there, and I heard a voice and I heard all these things, you know, combined with the normal things that we talk about, like ergotism and, you know, other poisonings and malnourishments that can happen that can induce vision. You know, be a holy anorexic, you can make yourself think that you're going to the night flight in a different way. You know, it's just it's night rave instead. The notion of or the detail of taking clothes off obviously makes sense in terms of slathering with ointments and so forth, and the, you know, being skyclad maybe as well. Or you know, alternatively, that there's some reference to the Adamite heresy there. I'd be interested to hear what you had to reflect on in relation to shapeshifting and skin leaping and things like that as well. Well, the turn skin itself. So if the spirit leaves the body, then first off, we're inhibiting the body as little as possible, and not weighing it down. But there's also something interesting, right? That you're preparing to leave the body by first off leaving your clothes. It's this wonderful thing of like setting things in motion, that kind of easy hypnotic thing of like, it's hard to get out of bed, but if you tell yourself to move your pinky, it gives you something to move forward with, which is Ericksonian in that way. But
Right.
if we start by taking off the clothes, that there's something already being taken off. So taking off the body is the logical next step.
Just keep going. Yeah. Yeah.
The serpent must shed its skin. At least the way that I romanticize it in that way. Certainly the differences of what goes into that and the descriptions of those things, like, is it a poison? How do we know what the right amount to use? All those different considerations. That's flying ointments, and that's a separate category. And of course, pay attention to legality, and all of you brave psychonauts out there. Legally, we neither condone nor condemn such practices. It's all on you. But give me some bear fat or lard induced or lard imbued ointments there, and have at it. I think the conflation with these practices, we certainly get a different exposure when we start getting into New World colonial accounts, because the witch trials also change heavily when they get to the New World, right?
Yeah.
So like, because of the administration of the courts being so many hundreds of miles away, simple love charms was not enough to get someone condemned. They were just like, please stop sending me those letters. I don't care that she's helping people get married.
Yeah.
It was like, send me the people that are killing people. Like, that's it. And just think of like, we're still dealing with this. Like, we can't get fresh water, and I'm supposed to sit here and read this letter about someone getting upset that someone got and still speaks the native language.
Right. Which again highlights that the things that bother authority are the magics that challenge authority. Not to sound too obvious about it, but like, that's kind of always been the case with love magic, right? We're a lot less fussed. The authorities are a lot less fussed about that love magic that can shore up the authority of a patriarch of a home, right? That ensures that a woman does not wander or embarrass her husband in a village. But the minute it's used for, making the young lord fall in love with the penniless pauper, then we have issues, because we're crossing class lines at that point. And with primogeniture being what it is, who you marry and the kids you have is very much informs whether or not your family wealth is going to continue or not.
Yeah, you're interfering with the Kwisatz Haderach, probably.
You thought only of yourself.
You loved him too much. Yeah. Speaking of loving little things like that too much, Mandrake has its own tie-in, obviously, here, but the concept of love apples and the Mandrake was Hildegard's big thing, that it's a cure for depression. It was like, if you take any psychoactive substance enough and you die from it, it's definitely a cure for depression.
Oh yeah, dry those tears. This one weird trick.
And of course, there's the biblical thing of songs mentioned in Song of Solomon. It's Jacob to Leah. Rachel trades Jacob to Leah for mandrakes, right? And he has to spend even longer laboring to do things to get his second wife that he actually liked. He got stuck with the cow-eyed wife first. Cow-eyed is such a lovely term.
It's beautiful, so evocative.
Yeah, but that. Mandrake, and it's the obsession with the human form. Anything that looks like a human, we are programmed to recognize faces and things, of course.
Pareidolia, right?
Yeah. And to recognize the human form already has this thing. Certainly, if something is bifurcated and then has a little thing growing out at the fork of that, it immediately evokes phallic nature.
Right.
This is, and the reception of those things, the interplay there. So any plant that has this type of root, for me, I was fascinated, still am, for years, of the kind of parallels and subtle differences between similar things like the man root of the Americas, ginseng, and specifically white ginseng. Red ginseng is Asian. But the lore about that access to the dream world, that it runs from you, that it has a family of roots that grow out of this thing, and Mandrake itself has its extensive lore of just its relationship to ferrous materials of blood as well as metal, and what those things do to it. That doesn't need to be harvested with metal. Does it not need to be harvested with metal?
Right.
You tie the black dog to it. Hello, Agrippa. But that they grow best underneath the gallows, where the semen of hung men.
Yeah, that terminal seed thing that Bill Burroughs is so fascinated with is another layer of like not just phallic but explicitly kind of seminal kind of mysteries there.
And I enjoy it, in our discussion of spirits or lesser deity, little demigods that are born from larger god experiences, and that the mandrake is formed as a mannequin from the clay that Adam was also formed from. So it did not have the same breath of God put into it, but the clay that Adam was formed from also brings out the little mandrake.
We're cousins.
Yes. So
distant cousins.
Affinity in that way, or that Hildegard specifically names it as hot and dry, which is an interesting side of it. It is incredibly warming, right? My fair share of mandrake in life. There's a lot of, everybody has their opinions about like balancing out that and Hildegard certainly recommends if a man can't control their heat, that they should take the female route, and if a woman can't control her heat, that she take the male route. There's already this,
and that's where, humanly speaking, it often gets called phlegmatic. I think Culpeper calls it that, but I think that's for its use in adapting or suppressing heat, rather than it being itself cooling. If there's a distinction that can be made there.
There was something with Hannibal too. Hannibal gave a bunch of mandrake wine, left it behind, and came back because people were, bombed from it.
Yeah. Well, I mean that hits pretty neatly into the thing that Giambattista Della Porta says about it, which is that it's terribly fun to spike your friends at a party with it. He says, I found the quote because I feel like I've referenced that before. He says, "When you would use it, give it to somebody to drink, and whoever shall taste it after a deep sleep will be distracted, and for a day shall rave, but after some sleep will return to his senses again without any harm, and it is very pleasant to behold."
I remember one of the Pharmaco books. I can't remember which one it is. Maybe it's not Poia. It's either Gnosis or Dynamis. It's probably Gnosis. Pendle.
Pendle
drops this elephant bomb at the end of the Mandrake entry, which is that elephants are said to eat it when they want to copulate. The female eats it and then offers the kind of overripe ones to the male. Have you ever seen elephants have sex? That's some strange. That's a whole world moving thing there.
It takes
it takes under a minute. Because there's so many muscles that massage the male that he ejaculates very quickly, but also, it's a penis that's bigger than an average adult man. Yeah. But it's just an interesting thing that the notion of it being love apples and this connection to it's not, it is said to be an aphrodisiac, but you don't read as much lore necessarily talking about it causing erections so much as amorous warmth all over the body and a desire for people, which then has its own results in that way. But that elephant bomb is I always remember it of what is a strange thing. It's like bears and aspirin. Did we learn to eat mandrake from watching elephants? The way that we learned about aspirin from bears, chewing on willow bark. I don't know, but certainly the idea of being a holy anorexic and the only thing that you eat is mandrake is its own wonderful thing. The idea of just eating communion, also from a sorceress side, for the kind of Hispanic thing of cursing someone when the host is in your mouth comes to mind, or that when you have God in you and you're in a purified state and you bring communion into your mouth, the words you speak manifest as if God is saying them. That the voice,
right, you've got the stem cells of Jesus in you.
Yeah, so
breathe your magic into it.
the holy anorexics are the ones that can do anything because there's nothing impure in them right then.
Right.
Anorexia, not condoning it, but the idea that it interferes with your cycle and therefore the stain of Eve goes away. Believed by many to be in support of it. Why it would be a high, in addition to the vision causing, inducing vision side of it. But
well, it also fits from a soteriological perspective. I mean, like sin and less salvation in an eschatological context, but more just if bleeding is seen as, like you say, the if menstruation is a curse that women must atone for, and this form of atonement, extreme fasting produces an end to that, then it would seem to be a bodily evident cure, right? A penance served.
So even the notion that Catherine of Siena transmutes her menstrual cycle into stigmata through fasting,
right?
There's a transubstantiation of her own blood, because there's all this emphasis on bathing in Christ's blood. I mean, it is like are you familiar with that very American Power in the Blood song?
I don't think so.
Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would
Sweet.
you victory over evil win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, wonder working power. It's one of those things of like, in the blood of the Lamb. It's just these very American hymns that are just like, bathe in the blood, bathe in the blood, bathe in the blood.
Sweet.
That are its own kind of extremely mystical, horrific sounding to the outsider. It's that side of it that when you're when you're the fish and you don't realize you're in water yet, it's certainly like, well, I don't know what those other religions are thinking, but like, I'm fine with eating Jesus once a week. And certainly it's been mentioned so many times in different Protestant attacks upon the mysteries of transubstantiation, is like the absurdity of saying that that's Jesus in that way.
But only sometimes.
But only sometimes. And certainly you guys did it so much more interestingly, the Anglican Episcopalian divide there, that it's accessible to all that attend Mass. It's not unified in that belief. It's up to each person, but they do not have to turn someone away because they are not Christian or because they're not Anglican. Whereas the Catholics, we capitalized on the exclusivity, right? If you could steal the host, but I remember distinctly being told in CCD that if you weren't Catholic and you hadn't received First Communion, that the wafer went back to being a wafer.
Right, you got theft devices cooked in.
And I was like, that's where, I don't know when we got that, because it definitely in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, like that, to steal the host was like, it didn't matter what you did, you could use it. It didn't suddenly stop being Jesus.
There's an interesting take there that like you have to be prepared for the ritual as well as the ritual has to be prepared for you. Right? You have to have experienced a change. You have to have gone through a thing that marks you as different at the end of it. You have to be part of the communion of the saints.
Oh, what's that lovely quote? If you don't see Jesus in the beggar at the door, you won't see him in the cup of wine. Beautiful sentiment even there. But I think that's very Franciscan, like, preach the gospel at all times, but when necessary, use words.
One of to return briefly to menstruation again, there is a notion that's kind of latent in a lot of pre-modern European humoral theory based off this like fundamental, this notion of like the fundamental evil of menstruation, and it's kind of a counter to it, but it's used to justify it in that kind of paradoxical way that a lot of aspects of the massive ideas that are kind of homogenized into being called a single humoral theory are kind of shoved. That this is that menstruation is a natural phlebotomy, right? Which some authors even say like, oh, does this mean that women are naturally purer? No, it means that their evil bodies require them to do this just to get to normal, right?
Building life is really fucking hard.
Yeah.
If you had the creation of the world and the destruction of the world happening inside you monthly, you might need to purge some of that. This is something that comes up in discussions of the roles, the gendered roles in many traditional religions, Aphrodisiasporic traditions, the wearing of skirts, for those that menstruate, and the discussion of heat. It's something that we've talked about, I've talked about a lot with my godmother over the years, of the notion of the womb that bleeds as being the actual marker of what's being discussed, for dress codes and a lot of things. But the spin that it gets in this horrible, if anybody has interest in really blowing their minds on feminist theory and its lack of universality outside the Western worldview, The Invention of Women is a fantastic book that is written by a Yoruba, she's technically royalty, I believe, from a royal family, but she went to Berkeley and got interested in queer and feminist theory, and went back to Nigeria to try and analyze Nigerian culture through this Western feminist lens. And she realized she was horribly changing her data to fit the lens she wanted to view it through. And that she realized that Nigeria's history pre-colonization, the language itself is dealing with a non-biological determinist idea of gender and sex, where the West, from its European origins, is dealing with biological determinism, that men are inherently better than women, and that race plays into the golden chain theory and everything going there, domesticization through taming of animals and everything, through domesticization and taming being the same thing there. But that looking at that idea of even translating the word king was a fascinating thing, that the word king can imply male or female. So when the Yoruba were exposed and asked to name their kings, and they said, oh, that's the male rulers in charge. They named the male rulers, but they left out all the female because the person asking had just told them that they wanted the male rulers.
Right.
But we are losing gaps of history because of the way that information is being demanded, because it's hard to understand the what's being asked for. So the understanding of, I think the artwork on the cover of The Invention of Women is who's the most liberated of them all. It's a woman looking in a mirror. And it's trying to complicate our notions of how we view at other cultures and impose upon them through the liberated mindset of our academic ideologies. But all that tied in there, the idea with menstruation there that comes up of women have their own access to something that men never will. And there are cultures that ritually will demand that the man cut themselves in order to catch up with the women.
Right.
And you see this in some, I believe, Altaic cultures, certainly pre-Indo-European, European cultures seem to have this notion there. And that's fascinating to me, that we're talking about a very different understanding of this, that's a whole other thing. There's so many people that I would bring on the show to listen to them talk about that. Just notions of this and what identity and gender and sex and different waves of feminism and things that have to be obliterated in order to actually invite discussion as opposed to project theory.
Yes, that's a lovely distinction.
But okay, so the other thing that it brings into this idea of the Eucharist as the food for the holy anorexics. The Eucharist, when we look at Saint Clare of Assisi, whose icon is used to represent lunar powers in New World syncretisms a lot. Because the host in the monstrance looks like the moon. It's white. It can look like the sun too, but for Saint Clare specifically, of the holy anorexic and the reliance on the host, this thing that is predictable but only gives us nourishment a little bit, which is totally lunar in that sense, right? That we're waxing and waning. There's a light that will go away, which is of course a dying and a resurrection there is ready. I understand that it parallels the sun as well, but I think there's an intrinsic thing throughout Christian mysticism to bring the Marian and the female aspect to tie it into the moon.
Yeah.
I
think that lunary silvering does have a certain kind of notion of the style is the substance. Yeah. To an extent.
Even the universality of that too. We can always play with that, but it's one of the holes in early modern neo-paganism where if you're pulling out myths that are Celtic, where the sun is female and the moon is male, or other European cultures where it's the both luminaries are female. You have Greco-Roman mythology coming in where it's distinctly male sun, female moon.
Right.
It changes the dynamic of things when you start combining all these things, especially in a polarized neo-paganism as it developed. Fertility and sex, yay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going to go back to a humoralism in terms of like the moon card is still associated with Pisces. It's still a fundamentally phlegmatic sign. It's still about hope and fear and the projection of a passion that can't be present, because if it was present, it wouldn't be fear, it would be pain, or can't be hope, because if the hope is present, then it's not hope anymore. It's just the joy or the delight of the thing. So there's a necessary imaginative element to all that phlegmatism.
Yeah, because I mean, the crayfish is sitting there at the bottom of the card, wedged between the two towers, which is totally wonderfully frickin' the sphinxes in Never-Ending Story to me since I was a kid. Because of those darn little yods that are coming off. Also, I really like the moon card because in my obsession with Odu and there being 16, it's a 16 based moon, right? There's 16 major rays and 16 minor rays. So it actually echoes like a feng shui compass of Odu. In that way, which is a rare thing because you don't usually see 16 done. You see the 14 pointed star of Bethlehem and things like this. But most they're going to be 4, 5, 6, 7. The 8-pointed star is less fascinating, and a nonogram is just hard to draw.
Super hard to draw.
But also, I find it the idea that the yod, the flaming yods, the little yellow yods that are coming between the towers, are numbered at 15. But I always look at the way the road is between right by the wolf's throat. It looks like another yod, or a bone, too. Like it needs to be fed to the doggy. But yeah, the moon is also the contrast between. This is often one of the cards that's described in the study of Lenormand cartomancy as being like so importantly different.
Okay.
Meanings. But here's the thing. I mean, like meanings with the tarot, like there's established meanings, but there's so many schools of thought. And just because Rider-Waite and then the Thoth deck had their own ideas about what those are, like it's very hard to. We don't need to necessarily demand that everyone see tarot the same way.
Yeah.
But nothing, you're not going to get struck with lightning. Nothing's going to come down. But the crayfish itself is pretty damn old. It's definitely a Marseille image there. The towers, the two pups doing that. The moon always looks less than pleased in the moon card.
Right.
Even slightly perturbed and angry in the Rider-Waite. In that way. Yeah. Any other further thoughts on the moon card?
On the moon, yeah. I mean, it brings to mind again that notion of that it is the whiteness, right? That it's Labana. That we need a dark night to be able to.
Albus wonderfully there.
Say again.
Which ties to Albus wonderfully there.
Yeah. And that it's that there's a calm whiteness to contrast against not just the darkness that is the unknown, but the darkness that is a confusing unknown. Not just confused, but confusing, that like to wander through it is to embrace more confusion in that darkness. And that this fickle and fading alacritous whiteness is a guide, but is also a trickster. That stuff fascinates me. The mysteries of night that are present there are really interesting to me. And I even if it is slightly sort of, I've been thinking about Crowley as like Joe Rogan before Joe Rogan. Like it's like I love that quote for the moon about like, what is it? Whatever horrors afflict us, or terrors that assail the mind, or abominations that that make us that excite the loathing of the heart. That's the line. The answer is the same. How splendid the adventure. There's something a little bit like. There's something a little bit of a macho psychologist about that. Like I'm gonna how much can you bench in therapy kind of thing, like, oh, I'm gonna like treat it all as like how great the adventure, but also that's not like a terrible attitude to take, I don't think necessarily. It doesn't mean that we have to like, you know, which Lieber is it where he's recommending cutting yourself with a straight razor when you use you know, particular vowels. Is it Ugolum, maybe? Thelemites, get at me. But no, that notion of like, yeah, re-looking at the Dark Night of the Soul and what that, you know, what that might actually mean, and not just the St. John of the Cross poem, but like also the older bases of the idea of an unknowable path, right? It's not just doesn't just lack illumination. It's fundamentally a little bit unknowable. The obscure night, right? The obscura noche.
Mm-hmm.
That's, yeah, and then again, that poem has the line in looking at it again about fevered with love's love's anxiety, right? This again to me is incredibly phlegmatic, right? That all of those lovely features of anxiety is a waste of imagination, right? It births these beautiful monsters of exactly how bad things could go, exactly how much people secretly hate you. It's incredibly imaginative. But it, you know, we can also use that imagination to make you know, to build things that make us feel good, and more able to be in the world, not less.
Yeah, the Thoth deck is also interesting in its interpretation of the moon card, just in changing the wolf and the dog to Set and Anubis, and relying on Kof and the idea of the, I don't know, the reptile brain that's in the back of the head there, right? So, like the needs being taken care of, but the moon invites an illusion in that's very different, and to go between the psychopomp and the enemy is such an interesting side, and definitely carrying the mercurial and the Neptune in their hands, instead of the Ankh.
Yeah.
The Neptune side, of course, you know, with modern astrology of being associated with Pisces there too, is there, and the tying of the two figures, I'm sure, and all of these wonderful things. I also remember being fascinated when I first read about the specifics, EKG, but the brain, right? The waves that are represented by the waves on the top card of states of consciousness that are echoing or things like that. And I should have done more research to be like, oh, it's specific this thing, or that's a myth. That it is said to, like, I see people talking about the waves, but also the very specific patterns of it are supposed to represent some type of deeper level consciousness that's going on there.
Oh, interesting.
And the peaks and the valleys there. And it's also the progression from the star to the moon is such an interesting journey in all the decks when we approach it. What is the card before it and what is the card after it? But I do think that one of the masterful things of the Thoth deck in the major arcana is just this very obvious, like, something is going on. The moving from the spirituality of the star and the guiding light there to something now. The moon still obscures the stars. It's still brighter than the stars. You don't see the stars that are directly around the moon. It takes more prominence in the sky, and to the point where we think the moon is huge in the sky, and it's actually very tiny still. Our head makes it bigger in our memory, in our vision.
Right, closer to the Earth, it looks bigger. Yeah,
but even so, you can still blot it out from your thumb. And if you think about the magnet, it's we come across this when you try to take a photo of it on your camera, on your phone. You're like, man, it's so tiny. And you look at it,
in disappointment. Yeah,
you think it's the size of, it's taking up half the sky.
Right.
But I don't know, there's something there. The moon seems to, the moon card does seem to have its deceptive qualities associated with it, or that there's an illusion going on, that things are not what they seem. And that definitely brings up shadow self. And for those of us that, embrace trickster as a part of our magical workings, there's confronting the hidden self here, giving it expression, even allowing it to take on an identity that you can interact with, the kind of feeding your demons mentality. There's something born here in the moon that digests things, the moon that receives the souls of the dead and then distributes them to the world of the dead.
And that it's that doorway and also the messenger of everyone else, right? That there's that it's the porthole through which souls do metempsychosis, but it's also the place where they live. That it's a door and a land in of itself. It's also the messenger between the other stars and that carries the rays of their light, right? I think it with the very strong proviso that comparing Yoruban deities to planets is obviously a fool's errand, and certainly trying to do that in any typological way. The references that are made to Eshu and Elegua-like forces as inherently mercurial in those lazy colonialist endeavors, because intermediary, because the messenger, because even the opener of the way, but it's the moon in a lot of what's going to get called quote quote Western astrology that usually isn't, that's carrying things and opening the way for other planets to do their thing, right? Moving across the sky so alacrotously.
Lunar spirits, what we do, right? That it's the closest onion layer to Earth,
right?
And even the idea that when the moon is in conjunction with a star, a fixed star, that this is a time to work it, because it's amplifying the rays and administering it through the moon's own light, which is a very different thing than waiting for it to, speaking as fixed star stuff, of waiting for one of the Beheni to align with the planet conjunctions as Agrippa proposes, or putting it on the rising or the midheaven, or these different practices that people use. But there are many folk traditions of using the moon, conjunction with the moon specifically, to do this.
Right. That quality of the way it flips light as well from, and maybe this is an inheritance of, having bashed my head against Hermetic Kabbalah and its notions of Kaf and Kof, but the light there isn't the light that makes clear like the light of the sun. It's the light that silvers and, renders that quicksand to look like a beautiful meadow, right? It's light that changes what something looks like. We have to have light to have optical illusions. And so that, which isn't necessarily to say it's just deceiving, but there is another perspective. And as it moves so quickly, we're going to see a bunch of those perspectives as it arcs across the sky each night.
The alternative versions of the moon card too are quite interesting, right? You get everything from the kind of Midsummer Night's Dream representation of the moon, of the man carrying sticks and the lantern, to the distaff bearing woman who's spinning under the moon, and there's this is Flemish, Belgian, and French decks that sometimes have this woman sitting by a tree or by a chimney, something tall and vertical, which we just talked about, the household crafts of spinning as trance-inducing. But I love it when the tree becomes a chimney, that when the blasted tree, the lightning-struck tree, becomes the tower, and this kind of things that we can travel up and through the portal, the sky hole, the Pleiades, the moon disk. How do we access the higher worlds? Is fascinating there. But hidden enemies and error and darkness, and even the understanding that the moon as the deity of death in so many cultures, in the sun being the deity of life, or is fascinating in that way.
Have you seen is it Kubo and the Two Strings? Kubo, the animated movie?
I have not yet. It is on my should watch this.
Ah, so good. Such a great, I don't want to spoiler it for you, but like phenomenal lunar grandfather antagonist god who just wants everyone to return to the eternal whiteness of a perfect, calm heaven where nothing happens. Like, why would you be? Why are you so obsessed with this place that it like makes you so upset and hurts you so much? Why can't you just come back to like the white room of nothingness? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's some there's a little bit of like Grandfather Obatala, the villain there, that it made me think of, and also just like a beautiful film in terms of the stuff about like ancestor, not just veneration, but like the journey of working more closely with your ancestors and what that provides.
Something too in the little yods that fall from the moon and the reflection in the water that reminds me too of like feeding blood to the Mandrake, the reflection of yourself in the soil, and dragon beneath your feet, and the feeding of seminal fluid or menses or blood of the veins in that way. That
the temperamental nature of actual drakes as well, right? I mean, I've encountered the ones that you've grown for a good while, and certainly talking to other people, that phenomenon of like, I thought they'd died. I was sure they'd died. The like all the leaves fell off. They looked very, very, very dead, and then one day they just like started growing again, which is not the same as like a dormitude. Is that the word for it? It's not going dormant or hibernating. It just seems to be.
I like using the dormition, kind of like the Virgin Mary when she transitions into her heavenly state.
Right, there we go.
But yeah, I had a dried root that was given to me, and I put it in a glass test tube, and 20 years ago probably at this point, and 3 years later, I mean, it was dried, it grew a single flower because the humidity in the test tube, I guess, made it enough that part of it came back to life.
Glorious.
So it's its own, there's something very interesting about that. I also like that in much of the lore around Mandrake, and certainly Shulgi starts to kind of hint at this, that, fumigating the tools that are necessary in order to dig Mandrake up, you fumigate with Mandrake itself. So there's this kind of like, you have to get some of that, and just the transference of the scream. And certainly, I mean, like Harry Potter Mandrakes are adorable. We've had a lot of experimentation, not only with the living ones, but the sculpting of idols that Troy has done for the store. Just in life-size, baby size, but understanding the eidolon as its own thing, that we are carving the Mandrake. And of course you can use Bryony, but the roots were often carved. They don't just naturally always look like human.
Right. A mandrake is a root that looks like a man, and therefore it's not cheating to take another kind of root and train it or carve it necessarily. This difference between, I was discussing this with our good friend Professor Charles Porterfield about the use of a black cat in certain crossroads rites. And that there is a tradition of like, on the one hand, it says that the cat shouldn't have a single white hair on it, but there is a tradition of like, if you can't find an entirely black cat, that you can shoe polish it, and that this isn't seen as cheating. You're fulfilling the letter of the law. Yes. That like it said a black cat. It didn't say a cat born black, and that there's a certain level of, but that's not the same as just cheating of just saying.
Cat, I named thee black.
Yeah. I know you're a big fan of that, like on the fly baptism thing, and I understand it has its own power, that like we label it such and we call it such.
Relationship with everything I say, it all works out.
It's very consistent. Very consistent.
No one argues me like I argue me.
But that was something I wanted to get at. Was like, a mandrake is a root that looks like a person.
And just also it's important, I think, dragon, sure, but also remember that a male duck is a drake, which gives you an insight into male ducks and how horribly nasty creatures they are.
Oh God.
but also just that I sometimes like to envision it as a man duck under the earth, which is its own lovely cloacal adventure.
Oh God.
Cloaca waka waka. But
Waka waka waka. Phrase labyrinthine vagina isn't used enough.
The side with Mandrake too is that finding a root that works, that they can grow very large. As you're carving, you would snap off the extra limbs and it would heal over, but you can take that and plant that and it would grow into a new Mandrake. But that you could end up through several successions replanting and it grows. Certainly, I think one of the lovely full-on descriptions of this is still Mastering Witchcraft, Paul Hewson, like talking about this, of using Bryony even, or using Mandrake, but that digging it up, carving it into likeness, planting it again for a minimum of another lunar passage so that it heals over and it doesn't look cut as much. Right. And that you could plant barley in where the hair would be, so that when you dig it up again and it dries, it now has hair.
I mean, this is also wonderful training for how to approach burying things for a lunar cycle as well, right? That you're not just putting it somewhere to soak in virtue, which is certainly, one of the main ways that I approached, interment of things. And certainly that's, a key ingredient in a lot of, Agrippa talking about how to consecrate magical objects. But it's also that you are planting something.
Yes. And the nice thing about the planting too is it does obviously takes on the characteristic of the land around it. And certainly wild Mandrake is amazing for this because that it's picked that spot to thrive, but that we can incubate it with the things of our choice. We can amend the soil. We can go pour our blood into the soil. Not necessarily, right. If your blood goes onto the leaves, it'll drop its leaves. It doesn't like the liquid. I mean, it depends on how much blood you're giving it. But in for a penny, in for a pound. But that programming the soil then to be receptive, and the Mandrake already has a taste for you. It already has this built-in relationship that be crowning the Auron and keeping it near the door in silks, in little coffins, in Mandrake phylacteries, in little tabernacles. I
love those coffins. They're awesome.
It's fantastic. And even the idea of the mannequin and what this is. I mean, I can't sing the praises of The Secret Life of Puppets enough, as far as a comparative literature book looking at the entire history of the simulacra of the human. It looks at everything and
puppets, etc. Yeah, we're not just talking about like Jerry Anderson and things with strings. Yeah,
and just the talking statues to everything, to our own appearance in literature, and watching our loss of miracle, as the industrialized post-Protestant modern worldview starts to arise, and the loss of miracle means that we have to terrify ourselves in order to feel anything, and therefore the grotesque and the arabesque derives, and there's something there, which I wonder if there's some root of that, of like the call to embrace what was political propaganda. Certainly, it doesn't mean that whether we want to debate the historical reality of practices being demonized by the church or the state in order to exact, take property or control a people, that's a separate conversation. But we know that it was a propaganda system to define witchcraft and use certain ways of discussing it that then has now, under the lens of traditional and folkloric witchcraft, become embraced as a starting point.
Yeah.
And Murray used Isobel Gowdie's confessions to craft her work. That this notion of the 13-member covenant and other things was one of the things that came up a lot at the Cornwall conference last year.
Yeah.
I guess we don't have to worry about going to it this year because the quarantine is still on. But if you're listening, Boss Castle, we love you and thank you so much for the conference every year.
Yeah.
But last year was on Isobel Gowdie, and it led many interesting things about the conceptions of forced confessions versus volunteered confessions, the notions and the overlap between fairies and devils, and which is a whole other side of it, and that's certainly something that Troy and I talk about all the time, of just we have dehorned the demons and definitely diminutized the fairies to the point where these are terrifying things. I love that we've talked about many times, that like even that image, right, of the winding sheet of invoking the dead is the point of invoking the dead. The act of necromancy in the exposition in the book is to then have them call the fairy queen.
Yeah.
And like that's a huge thing. That's not the understanding of like, oh, we're talking the dead, we're dealing with the dead, we're having the pseudo spiritist adventure. But it's to call the thing that is other. And the dogs are barking outside, and Hecate.
It begins.
Yes, and one of my rats is standing up on its hind legs dancing. But yes, all the fairy queens, may they all come. And certainly if you add in Troy's big area of research right now, but looking at UFO phenomena as ties into as modern day expressions of fairy lore, that there's this huge data set, right, of abduction and fairy stolen mythology that we dismiss because our lens is geared towards pre-modern and early modern interpretations of these things.
Right.
Which doesn't mean that those things sometimes aren't completely fabricated and made up, but that there's so much going on. And a lot of what has been popularized in the media is very different than the accounts of the people that have been abducted. Like the guy who wrote Communion, which that book cover used to scare the crap out of me when I was little.
Stryber. Is that one of Stryber's? Yeah.
Yeah, that's upstate New York. And they're like little goblins that he first encounters, like little hairy beings. I saw the mock-ups for the movie, which I didn't know there was a movie, and apparently it's impossible to find because it was terrible. But the little things that he first starts talking to are basically like goblins. And then he was like, the amount of times that you read alien abduction accounts and they describe things that are fairy and goblins, that's a whole other thing. And that's Troy's absolute rabbit hole that he likes to go down. And I appreciate his exposing me to a bunch of things most of the time.
Well, it was likewise, absolutely likewise, and not to steal his thunder too much, but the material he was telling me about this seems apt, seeing as it was this week that the Pentagon seems to have announced that UFOs are real, and it's causing none of the controversy that say Margaret Murray expected it to. Margaret Mead, sorry, who consulted the government apparently.
Little Freudian.
Yes. Another Margaret we don't like, Margaret. No, just the stuff that Troy was telling me about going through the records of the way these entities communicate as well is very fairy in a lot of ways. Like the parallels.
Ball lightning, which is a quintessential part of like Alpine and Pyrenean folklore with the fairies and the elves. That there's something quite interesting there. That Isobel Gowdie's, they're given elfin shot, right? They're given elfin arrows, which is a big thing, and that they flick them with their thumbs. They're not given a bow to discharge it, but they try and hit their target by flicking their thumb. The arrows launch out, but they're not very accurate. She said, the critique of them.
That's the part that's one of the parts that feels very like not believable, like the rest of her doesn't seem believable, but that's the part that seems very human, right? We do this thing, it works sometimes.
Yeah.
Do we want to move to? I feel like we're a suitable crossroads. We could move to Isobel, or we could move to Ashtaroth.
Yeah, I think we keep touching on Isobel as it is. So yeah, bring up. Let's go to Ashtaroth and see how we tie in Albus, because I know we've even discussed Isobel far more than we've discussed some of our poor dead magicians in the past on previous episodes. So
it's true. Yeah. We're getting better again. So it can be
come to the Sabbath. Come to the Sabbath.
Come to the Satan's there. I love that. Like, who all's there? Oh, Satan's there. All right, cool. Yeah. I'll put in an appearance.
I just like they scream out Ashtaroth in a way that it's hard to understand who they're actually like applauding is there.
Yeah. It's very someone just jumped through a paper star wipe, isn't it? It's very TV presenter. Astaroth. Bless. I've been trying to trace a useful timeline to talk about Ashtaroth / Ashtaroth / Asherah / Astarte, etc. I think starting with the demon and then working back to other earlier things might make more sense. I mean, in terms of like sheer demon of the week or of the session. 1400s, right? We get the Byzantine things like the Hygromantia known as the Magical Treaties of Solomon, where they're a big deal in there, as also CLM 849, right? The Munich manuscript, the Forbidden Rites spends its time analyzing. So we have this earlier Byzantine thread, and certainly the spells where Astaroth is invoked in the language, in the parlance of the times. 'Twas the style of the time with Lucifer and Beelzebub. Right now, this is not the only triumvirate model. There's the LBS of Lucifer, Beelzebub, Satan as well, which is also, or Satan, which is also particularly popular. But we get Astaroth turning up very early along with those two as a very senior figure. The three names being invoked in there's a Byzantine spell that Jake pulls out for consecrating an image to do love magic with, that calls on all three of those as a kind of infernal hierarchy. And then by the time we get to the 16th century, we've got the Cambridge Book of Magic is listed there. Obviously turns up in Uncle Heinrich's 3 books. Obviously turns up in Vea, Prestigious Demonorum, and therefore, Book of Officers of Spirits, the thing called the Book of Oberon, obviously in Discovery of Witchcraft, then Book of Abramelin, the one that's published right at the start of the 17th century. They're mentioned in the Loudun possessions as well, interestingly. So we do start to get we do have accounts. It's not just a literary tradition of turning up in a bunch of dusty old grimoires. They're also turning up in actual possession cases. Big deal again in the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, again with that LBA triumvirate format, set to rule over Wednesdays typically. Then the Magus compiles all of that kind of stuff, and the Verum also compiles a bunch of the mixtures of earlier De Secretis manuscripts that sometimes call that third chief Elastor, but sometimes gets, by the time we get to Verum, which is a 17th and even 18th century take on that much earlier text, then Astaroth has become they've reintegrated this more familiar older chief. But of course, all of that, we're only going back to 1400s there. All of this is predicated on a set of similarities that are being drawn, like the parallels and the similarities are being drawn at the time as well to Ashtaroth, mentioned in the Bible. So we get Astoret or Ashtoreth or Ashtoret or Astoret as a distortion of Ashtart, it seems. And it's said that probably because the last 2 syllables have been pointed to vowels. And that gives us, where is it? Bosheth, which is one of the words for abomination. So we start to be able to see how the name itself is being manipulated for, the use of etymology itself in demonologists' screeds. And then again, obviously, we've got the biblical Ashtoreth, which shouldn't be confused entirely with Asherah, right? Who we get in the Book of Kings, etc. Banging your head against Semitic languages themselves, and what's an aleph and what's a glottal stop, and so on. Becomes something that I quickly didn't feel I had the full qualifications for, in terms of tracing exactly how we get from one to the other, right? But this is the urtext example of the demonization of pagan gods as well. Like if we're going to take this to a modern historiographical dimension to Goetia, etc., right? This is the urtext example of, not all of these demons are horrible demons. Some of them are, beloved goddesses who were just on the wrong side of a Christian history.
nature of what is a demon as well is incredibly important to explore that. The larger concept of daemon and how it comes in, and certainly what that is. But yeah, I think there's also this weird kind of programmed thing in our brains as Westerners of the golden age fallacy that like the further back we can trace something, the more authentic it is, the more pure it is. And it's been really helpful for me in looking at other systems of understanding the progression and the evolution of things, and the answer to the needs of the people that things go through as value centers shift. Or even the chaos understanding that you can go from fanatic anything to another fanatic expression of something completely different, because fanaticism is the currency,
the zeal of the convert.
And because something is rooted in something else does not mean that the entity that is being identified as Ashtaroth is the same thing as the goddess. Here we
no, yeah.
Catherine of Siena is not Catherine of Alexandria just because they have the same name, and yet they are, but they're not.
They may share certain ritual features and flavors, and some stories may be shared. But and I don't think we have to get into a full chaos magic, gods only exist off our belief, and if we project a belief then it's a different entity. I don't think we have to go that far in terms of like these are all our a projected out psychologization to say the Duchess of Hell Astaroth is not the same as Astarte. Just functionally speaking, because if nothing else, we've had a good couple of millennia for that for them to go their different ways. There's some interesting features when we get to even that earlier feature though of like. So let's talk about Solomon, right? The Testament of Solomon lists Astaroth, Astera, with the hat, TH, which is said to be an angel that frustrates the fifth of those seven that are related to the Pleiades, who says they are power and that they raise up tyrants and tear down kings. And the angel that frustrates them is this Ashtaroth. And if we compare that to the passage in Kings about how Solomon is turned away from his good Christian, his good pious godly practice to an ungodly practice of following Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch.
That's what it was making me think of. The demonization of the derivation, the distraction from the path. It's the satanic verses, right? That Muhammad incorporates Al-Luza, Al-Alat, and Manat into the Quran and then removes them because Satan tempted him, and he could have incorporated these feminine powers which could have brought in more people, but it distracted from the oneness of Allah. So there's something in that too, that like when the temple, which incorporated temples to other deities that had been conquered in the air, it incorporates that's how kingdoms survive, incorporating the systems of the people they've conquered. And the shift also from high God to one God is something you can trace. And again, I always applaud Karen Armstrong's Field of Blood for this kind of wonderful evolution examination of that through history and the shifting thing that is Jerusalem. If we want to compare Ashtaroth to that like there is this relationship that things change and it fits the needs and the desires of the people, what we project upon it. But this idea that the organization of Ashtaroth, wow, that was, I don't know what vowels came out of my mouth there.
Right?
Ashtaroth. All the way.
There's also something there of like a consistency in actual role. So if we don't get too hung up on Angelos as messenger, or as in the Testament, it's obviously talking about what will later be called thwarting angels, or thwarting spirits. But if we just take that this is a powerful entity that can boss around another powerful entity, that's not inconsistent with any of the later takes on Astaroth as a chief, for instance.
I always wonder too if like just to complicate things, Ben will just make fun of me for this, but that like so there's the three Buddha bodies, right? One of which is the emanation body, where that an enlightened being can appear in whatever form is the most helpful to get the message across to the person that is the audience. And I always think about this with like, not necessarily in that bodhisattvic form, but like, is there this root entity that's just like, this is how we get offerings this year? Like, is it like the various expressions of diasporic religion where you got to keep up with the Joneses and like, you know, we're doing this festival this year because it's now popular to do this festival. And incorporation of trend into how these things go. Certainly the demons are their own memes in this amazing way.
Right.
We can sit there and argue the historical contextuals, the etymology of something, but if the majority of people are still remembering 2 or 3 accounts written by some prominent Goetic magicians in the 80s and 90s, they're going to form their idea about how it's supposed to appear based on those things.
Right.
And that's its own interesting thing too, to go from the kind of what's the guy poke runyon
martial art.
Sean Connery, but a little bit more drawn out.
Yeah, it's just a good mouthfeel to just put your mouth in, like
yeah. But that in the mirror is it's that the spirit in the mirror is its own thing. We go from the triangle as a container device being suggested that that's the only way to do it. We're like, but it's not in all the grimoires that way.
Right.
And the difference of just appear outside of the circle. I'm protecting the circle. I don't care what happens to the rest of the world. I'm protected right now. Or is the demon not like, is it just bound like a leash with a silver cord? Is it astral projecting from hell? Like,
Right.
Take it into like some Constantine thing here, or Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Like,
yeah.
what exactly are we dealing with?
Well, this is also a root approach to grimoires, right? That you need some secret key to make it work, right? I blame Waits for saying that like grimoires are unwieldy. Like you don't come across that many that require a phoenix feather or something. They're specific, and it might be a bitch to get up at that time and do that thing, but it's rarely.
One, it says the phoenix feather owl.
When
you have the complete one.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then we'll just call that anecdotal. No, but this root notion that like there's a secret that you need to unlock it, right? And that's what underlies Runyon's insistence on the Black Mirror, right? That this is the piece that's been missing and why it hasn't worked before and it won't work for anyone else until you do this one weird trick, trademark, right? And so that itself, I think, underlies or I think is undergirded by a particular bias about grimoires needing to be jailbroken as opposed to just paid attention to.
And even the kind of incorporation of grimoire material and spirit catalogs into hybrid creolization, Creole traditions in the New World, where there's already a working vocabulary and understanding of how spirit contact, spirit contract, spirit possession all work, and it's readily incorporated as a reality. There's no question of just incorporating those things, which is, it invites a very complex argument about things that we've talked about many times, that like it is simply incorporating Ashtaroth because you read about Ashtaroth in the Key of Solomon into your work make you a Goetic magician, or are you just working with a Goetic spirit? Is the reverse true, that if you call upon the King of the Seven Crossroads, are you a Quimbandero because you're now working with a spirit that usually is identified as a Quimbanda spirit? What are the landmarks of those things? And it gets a very blurry thing. It's, to me, there's still a little bit of it being like conceptions of who gets to call themselves a curandero in old school parlance. Like, well, somebody that heals people is called a curandero by those around them.
Right.
Maybe
I think we're even into this in terms of like, if you have to ask if you're a witch, you might not be. You know?
Yeah, certainly, shooting your bullets at the moon or screaming "I am a witch" 3 times into a 3-sided mirror is you've told yourself enough times you're a witch.
Right.
But and there's certainly an element of that too in Creole traditions of being told you worship the devil, and you're like, fine, I worship the devil, then I'm going to incorporate that devil shit too.
Right. He does have the best tunes. This is also interesting in light of by the time we get to Verum and things and
by the time we get to truth.
Yeah, exactly. But by the time we get to my favorite, we have Astaroth explicitly identified as ruling the Americas.
Don't listen to him. Excellent book of magic.
It knows I love it, baby. So
favorite. You're my bread and butter, but you're not my favorite.
You're all my brightest students. That's Brian Blessed in the made-for-TV MacGyver movie. Amazing stuff. Search for Atlantis, whatever it's called, Treasures of Atlantis. MacGyver. The idea that Astaroth rules the Americas is very interesting to me. Just and this is the schema where Beelzebub rules the Africas and Lucifer rules the Europes and the Asias. So this is a level.
Europe, really, Al?
Yes, I did. Yes, it's a contested field.
Also, if anybody's wondering, because of our physical distance, we are not astral projecting to talk with each other. We are over Zoom. So if some of these emphatic laughters become off a little more digital, this is my one apology.
Right in the middle. They're gonna hunt for that apology. I don't know.
This long.
It's true. The notion of rulership is interesting, and even we're not just talking about there's the Astaroth, there's the being that has a name like Astaroth that's a goddess, and this being that's a chief of hell. We also get, by the time we come to Vea, and especially by the time we get to the popularization of the discovery of witchcraft, we get Astaroth relegated from their role as chief as just another of the 72 or the 69. Nice, depending on which manuscript you're talking about. So there's more than one Astaroth as well, and this idea of are you working with the Astaroth of the Goetia of Solomon, or are you working with the Astaroth of Verum? Obviously we can complain about that being a wrong-headed question, but there's a difference in role, right? Even if we're talking about the same entity wearing different hats, still there's a difference between Astaroth in Scott's discovery and in what will be called the Goetia of Solomon, right? The great and strong Duke, again appearing as a foul angel, interestingly, on their dragon, carrying a viper, and all these kinds of things.
Or in the 1971 cult classic childhood favorite, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, where Ashtaroth is a wizard.
Snap!
The price in order to get the substitutionary locomotion spell in order to defeat the Nazis.
The best reason for doing Goetia, let's be clear. I think there's something. There are things that we can learn about demonology, both in terms of the study of demons and the study of our responses to demons, both in terms of Christian demonologists and practical demonologists, we might say, to go all Jonathan Strange about it. There's the fact that a popular name is going to keep cropping up in different contexts and be given different weights and cast different shadows adds to this, adds to the legions, frankly.
Yeah, that's an important side of considering all these things, right? That it's the Ashtaroth is different from an Ashtaroth,
right?
And this notion of this, that it is a spirit that appears in this thing, and that This is certainly many people go into the theories of this, so that the legions are because the spirit never leaves its kingdom and is sending a legion to you,
Right.
to appear. A little note on this, because we mentioned the king and the queen of the Seven Crossroads, Rey de Sete Encrucijadas and Reina de Sete Encrucijadas in Banda, are both associated with this spectrum that is Astarte to Ashtaroth. And Ashtaroth is specifically because of the Grimorium Verum association, given the placeholder for the king of the Seven Crossroads. And then in the even stranger, because this is the 50s and 60s and Fontenelle's list and this obsession with kind of collapsing these things to give it something more spooky, or perhaps it was certain houses that were incorporating these syncretic lists in this way, and there's definitely things that are traceable to Fontenelle and the creation of the 7 lines of Kimbanda at this time, which many people will argue, and this time most of the time most people still work in kingdoms, not lines. But that later descriptions of Pombagira start to have these lists that go up to, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list. It's about a dozen. Pombagiras are given correspondences, and the Queen of the Seven Crossroads is going to Astarte. And I do not, I mean, like, my memory even of Astarte in Catholic school is so much nothing like the Queen of the Seven Crossroads. So this, you know, how many Astartes are there in the world? Well, how many crossroads are there? But certainly the King of the Seven Crossroads as this force for action that is so kind of, as a katisu, as a spirit, is so almost notoriously benevolent in his interactions with things. He's a stable issue, as many of the Malay, as the, what is your term for them? The deputies?
Deputies, yeah.
Are that these the 6 that are under the high 3.
For Astaroth, that's Sagatana and Neberos, who are usually related to Veludo and Eshu Veludo and Eshu dos Rios, respectively.
Yeah, and Chankahua is sometimes given under King of the Seven Crossroads, and Chiriri as well. They all kind of flip between the Beelzebub and the Ashtaroth, which is wonderfully confusing. But you know, past the kind of specific esotericisms of that Ashtaroth can be an appended name onto the King of the Seven Crossroads, even in some pontos, pontos cantados. So are they calling Ashtaroth a demon, or are they calling Rey de Sete Encrucijadas, you know, has a new title, the way that many deities and spirits and value centers collapse into each other? That, you know, I find all that less fruitful to think on eternally than to actually deal with the King of the Seven Crossroads on his own terms.
Right.
But certainly it is interesting that the syncretism was so enough that they put the Queen of the Seven Crossroads to Astarte. And so we get these pagan goddesses that kind of come in, along with like Proserpina and Petitis. So you immediately go to demons, and then Balbereth, a male entity for Rosa Caveda, and Nagini, not the Harry Potter Nagini, but the Naga Queen.
Right.
And not all of those Pombagiras are as common in the possession cults. So it's interesting too that the list that was given is not necessarily of use for everyone.
No, it feels very reachy, frankly.
Especially the Pombagira list.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like specifically, like the counterparting in general, is an ongoing conversation. But the list of just like sinister, powerful lady spirits, demonesses, and witch queens. Like you can see what they're doing. You can see the evocative nature of like why they're picking those names is clear. But the very sort of like cross-cultural, running down. It feels more like running down correspondence lists, or not even, or just desperately reaching for sinister goddess names.
Agreed, very much. Sorry, I somehow muted myself. She did not want it spoken. But because, especially since we don't find, to my knowledge, any place where that specific list of lady spirits, pseudo lady spirits, is there. Whereas with the Eshu list, it is specifically Grimoire Verum, and then it's expanded upon to include, by many authors later, Key of Solomon,
Right.
like Mather's edition spirits.
Right.
So it's a very different thing when you go from Astartea to Petitis, Lilith, Proserpina, Klipoth, Mara, Balberet, Lamastu, Lamia, Nagini, Gothicula, like Rusalkis. Like what is going on here? And
yeah, the Rusalkis especially, right?
Yeah, it's there's something going on in Keteb for Pomojita do Sol, and not to derail it too much, but the thing with the Queen of Seven Crossroads and the King of Seven Crossroads, they both have the titles, right, of king and queen, but we know that the queen is the even more active partner in that pairing. That they may be a quote unquote mated pair, but she is the one who wears the pants. Not that he is without power, but he is much more amiable and sociable and deals with people directly, whereas she comes down and it's all her show, if that's the case.
Right.
Everything becomes her imperio at that time, her empire. And that's its own thing, which is, neither of them particularly feel like the Ashtaroth of the grimoires. However, there is always this hidden thing that the fire of Eshu that is in the big three is just underneath the surface. Even when a spirit, even when a Gatisu, an Eshu is talking with someone, it can always turn into that fire. Is it sending a legion? Is it sending a dead priest? Depending on which lineage or thought you are with Kimbanda, those things can change.
Right.
Is it an entity? Is it a dead practitioner? All those things will change from house to house. What Candomblé nation that has influenced that specific Umbanda or Kimbanda will change those opinions too. So I'm all for the multi-headed, scary Ashtaroth. There's something very interesting there. But the King of Seven Crossroads is a wonderfully stable, approachable Eshu out of the big three. Dealing with Eshu Lucifer, Eshu Mor, Eshu Redes, Eshu Crucialiades. The King of Seven Crossroads is the most easy to deal with, and contractually the most straightforward.
Kind of the most human, for want of a better term, or the closest to understanding humans.
If we can be so bold as to be understood.
Yeah, fair.
That was almost like a bastardized St. Francis prayer there. Wow.
I mean, I've found, if it's useful, I found that parallels that, Jake's very fond of considering it useful to look at Hecate when considering Astaroth, the Duchess of Hell, just as, in conversations with Peter and Alcestis of the Scarlets, they find looking at the figures that will become Aphrodite, as well as Ishtar and Inanna, very useful for considering Astaroth. So there's also ways in which, we don't have to equate in order to find adjacent mysteries necessarily.
And certainly, I think important too in understanding all apparitions, manifestations of these spirits and deities as a spectrum, in that when you're going with a Levantine spirit catalog, that of course, the birthplace of Aphrodite being Cyprus, there's going to be something that is contained, but is already going to start to containing what's to the west of it as well.
Right.
Just like language itself, that it doesn't suddenly become Portuguese when you cross into the Portuguese border in Spain. Spanish starts in one way in the east, and it slowly turns into something else as it goes west. And that perhaps there's something of that too with these spirits, that one town's Ashtaroth is going to be different from someone else's, another town's Ashtaroth. And the books, the grimoires, fuck with this even more. because now the book is written somewhere and somebody's specific experience is now the codification of it that is presented to someone else, which, you know, we've talked about this before, but you can actually rob the person of their own spirit sight because they're expecting what is in the book.
Bloody anthropologists.
Yeah. So we blinded ourselves there. So this notion of Ishtar, such as it is, I remember there was a distinct point where I was really confused in looking at Greek religion through Greek terms, through an increasingly understanding of how amazingly bizarre Greek culture was. But in my head, it was still Jason and the Argonauts from when I was a kid. And that the kind of Romanization, which inevitably makes things even more human than perhaps some of the Greek deities. They're human, but they're different, right? There's still a Titan level beyond them. And Aphrodite, especially being her own thing that is pre-existent before that, both an Olympian and also arising out of the primal ball juice. And foreshadowed by Eros there in the beginning of creation. But there's also not literalisms so much as comparative stories to describe her nature. And that the Anglicization, wow, that sounds weird, magic with a K, of Greco-Roman myth, by the time we get to its, you know, Edith Hamilton's book in my hands as a young child, presents these deities and spirits in a very specific way that is incredibly anthropomorphized beyond even conceptions of like Olympianness to me, that I look back now and look at classical studies in college and professors there that were desperately trying to break apart this kind of post 1800s ideas of what the Greeks were doing or what the Romans were doing or what the Egyptians were doing. Certainly what ancient Mesopotamia was doing. And conceptions that it's very hard to undo modern mindsets about what religion is and what it's like to appeal to a deity. And our notions of what polytheism has changed hugely in the last 30, 40 years in the understanding that polytheistic culture was not always like the gods as distinct personalities. You could combine gods to create your ideal god of the moment and talk to them. And it was real while you were praying to it. And this understanding it blows the kind of like, oh, how foolish they are to think that there's so many gods. They understood that they were manipulating the power of deity. Many cultures, I'm not saying that this is a universal applicable thing, but when we look at specifically Aztec culture or we look at Egyptian culture, there are differences in the way that they approach the polytheistic universe. And certainly it's not as simple as like, oh, they believe there's 12 gods or 24 gods instead of one. And it's blurry. So I think certainly demonology, demonolatry, demonalism, demoniacs, necromancy, necronomicon, Yahtzee, are the spectrum continues. And I just, Ashtaroth is a difficult one, because first off, the woodcut, just whatever.
Oh god, the De Clancy stuff.
They
can all suck a fuck, frankly.
Some of them are cute. Like Baal is cute. Adramelech is fun. Ashmedai is fun. Behemoth is fun. Ashtaroth, it's like the epitome of like over it. There is something that is a little bit like I don't know, Bronte having to deal with another suitor on the face. But there's also something of like very much like it's very Andrew Lloyd Webber looking too, interestingly. He's concocting the next Phantom.
Monstrous.
Also, the adversary of Saint Bartholomew always stands out to me, right?
I wanted to see if that was something that you jived with.
Saint Bart right there, right? So Saint Bart, the skin-flaying saint who has his own mythology across Christendom for being like snake deity syncretisms or dragon deity syncretisms or just the trickster that comes to steal your power, all these different things that can happen. Saint Bart is a roof saint. When your tool is the flaying knife, and you hold your own skin in your hand, standing there all like muscular, literally just the muscle. But like, how does this balance Ashtaroth? yeah, how does this, it's interesting. Just find that. And certainly
Well, is it Shetland Redgrove that talk about, again, back to menstruation as draconic, and that kind of make that equation of using that as a means of reading, that Astaroth, right, at least in the Scott's Discovery version, rides a dragon, holds a viper, is often very linked to serpentine kinds of things as well.
Yeah, and certainly the power over serpents is one of the gifts that Ashtaroth brings, and Bartholomew, being the skin-flayed saint, is always serpentine in that turn skin way. And that Bartholomew is specifically said to have understood the temptations of Ashtaroth directly, which is, sloth, right? Laziness, self-doubt. What is it? Seduces men by means of laziness, self-doubt, and rationalized philosophies.
I'm in this photo and I don't like it.
Yeah. Rationalized philosophies. Yeah.
Triggered, attacked.
That's what it should be.
Yeah.
Trigona Mercoides, Tricorum Satis D, and all those things.
Yeah, and the roots of I don't know. Certainly, have used for a very long time roses with Astaroth work, and so that connection shouldn't be, obviously the rose is like is a rose is a rose is a rose, and is the queen of flowers to Sappho, as opposed to just some just an urtext's love plant. But certainly I feel like the commonality of mysteries there, that like lots of these spirits and goddesses cohere around that swirling of the unending rose.
Okay, so to complicate that then, if Ashtaroth tempts through self-doubt and laziness and rationalized philosophy, so that does directly call out those of us that like to overthink things, right? That can justify anything through rational thought, even if it's no longer right. You can rationally defend irrationality.
Yeah.
So it feels like that's a natural segue to Albus.
It does, yeah, exactly. We've spent so much time talking about Rubius type things, blood, violence, the confusion of passing into death, and things of that nature. That, yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a really natural pivot to talking about Albus and the white, which is the only other explicit color. So not only is it upside down Rubius, so we have this like lovely alchemical opposition, non-dual opposition, non-opposing duality of the white and the red, geomantically speaking. Sometimes you see Puella being called fair or even pale. And sometimes you see Tristitia being called, referring to things that are black. But the two explicit colors there are the white and the red. And so red is the opposite of white. Like it's the upside down. It is the cup arighted as opposed to the cup upside down, if we're going to look at the form of the figures pictographically, which, as I think I've ranted about before, I'm sure is about cupping, not just about the spilled wine glass of Rubius and the spilling of wine and blood, but the upending of a cup to heat it and to put it to the skin for phlebotomy, which is also a Rubius thing. So the cup has been arighted, the goblet, or the inkwell, as I prefer, is like face up. And so you have that lovely 2-2-1-2 format of Albus. And I think a good place to start with Albus is like, is its whiteness, right? It's the white of the writing paper, the yellowing white of old pages and tomes and scrolls. I like to extend that with like the notion of a body of work to talk about Albus being the white bones of ancestral wisdom. It's also laboratory white, right? White like the coats, right? Like cleanliness, like sterility, like the face of a mime, but also sagacity, therefore, right? Like the hair of the elderly, the white of judges' wigs. and all of that seems to cohere in a sense of clarity of thought, and again some quartzy type things, right? White as black as barren blank space as well, but also white as the kind of heated filament of the cartoon light bulb of Eureka, right? All of those notions of peace, purity, and wisdom, and the standard stuff. Well, not standard maybe, but I think I like scaffolding a little bit, so it's easy to talk about Albus as emotionless, as the robot learning to love, or the Star Trek Vulcan, as opposed to the Hephaestus Vulcan. But the some of the delineations of Albus it gets very emotional. Especially when you're saying something that is wrong on the internet about your favorite topic to nerd out about. There are definitely some delineations that say, Albus is not this usual shy, aloof, not shy halud, ivory towering academic. It's also right up in there in some arguments as well.
Well, it would have to be, because if you look at it graphically, right, it's not the container that is populous that can allow for all things, but it's literally pinched at the anus,
right, tugged from the groin of its waterline. So the thing that's holding it together is that tension. So it imagines that the head is very large and able to be filled, but it's still holding everything together by clenching that butthole. And this is interesting links to the moon as well, and the whiteness of the moon. I read from a Hedonian perspective, so I consider Albus an airy figure. Our good friend and colleague Sam Block of the Digital Ambler reads it, which is also a very traditional reading of Albus as a watery figure, and that fits in very neatly with some of Sam's work on the four figures that have only one quote unquote active line, and those being elemental. So Laetitia being not just a fiery figure, but kind of like the fiery figure. Rubeus being the airy figure, Albus being the watery figure, and Tristitia being like the earthy figure, because they have a single dot in their respective elemental lines there. And for me, like, Albus is such an airy intellectual figure that it's not a stretch, but it's interesting for me to consider it from a different angle as a watery figure, and the root notion of what we're doing when we're not just being academics or being researchers or being archivists, which is really, I think, the big deal with Albus. But that notion of like the pooling of like knowledge as watery is interesting to me. We're back to ink mysteries a little bit here. But ultimately, you've also, most of the time, the point that we can agree on is that Albus is a mercurial figure. I've not really seen it attributed to any other planets. It is the day side of Mercury. It's everything we do know about Mercury. It's the archivist, the guide through the library, as opposed to everything we don't know about Mercury, the two-headed or the two-faced devil at the crossroads that we get with Conjunctio.
How does the daughter of astrology here deal with Mercurial's mercuriality in that? Meaning, I know that there's these paired planetary correspondences, but Mercury being good with good and bad with bad type of. Right.
We don't get It's the thing that's sometimes called Mercury's quote instability or instability. It seems to do the kind of like goody baddie pretty neatly with the diurnal and the nocturnal. The Albus is Mercury by day. Generally pretty good, generally moving towards ingenuity and industry. Those are two of the buzzwords that we get with Albus a lot. And then I think Conjunctio is definitely the night side, and seems to be the dodginess of Mercury as patron of thieves and things like that. Albus is pretty clear on what it means. It's bringing expertise to something. Conjunctio, I would say, is a bit more of that good with good and bad with bad, because it's about connecting up, right? And if you're connecting up with, what are you tying yourself to? What are you signing an X on a contract that you might not be able to read? So there's definitely a lot more of that ambiguity with Conjunctio, I'd say.
The the correspondences are varied. This is this is one of the Ifa Odu, in the sense that this is a higher up. This is 15 shells.
Right.
Maruna, which Brazil, one of the primary refrains would be a soldier is always alert. And then the kind of other refrains that you hear for this, a good general does not send his best soldiers into battle. My father told me to carry the bag of success on my neck, and so I will not surrender the prosperity of that to anyone. You have to keep it with you, right? You can't distribute it. You can't hide it. It has to be on you. Strong people work to make others strong. It's an Odu that calls for leadership through example.
Okay.
Shrines will always be shrouded in mystery. Ties heavily into, right, of course, the I forget my Latin names, but the cloth that goes over the square that goes over the communion wine here. That there's a lot of opportunity for vanity and constantly feeling misunderstood in this sign. Rejection is not so easily dealt with in this sign, especially in dealing with love. It's not always the best sign for health. It kind of represents a fragility health-wise, and does have a call to attention. There's an extreme need to tend to the fire here. In larger context, there's connections to Ibeji, to Oba, and these other Elegua, Osai, things moving through here, very finicky things that need to be taken care of with focused attention. So that soldier is always alert comes to mind here. And even so, like if we're extending it to just a looser interpretation and going geomantically to understand that the cup that you're carrying, right? If it's, especially when we're going into like a Christian inheritance of not spilling the blood of Christ, not letting it turn into Rubius.
Certainly the finickiness of like keeping things white seems present. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I mean, definitely like in, say, in the sixth, like Albus is about like, if you're ill, you're not getting better anytime soon. It's not necessarily like a, you're in serious danger of getting worse, but it's, there's a sterility to Albus. So it's not just everything has to be just so OCD style. There's a sense of like, can't really function unless things are a particular way.
I mean, there's definitely this idea of the threat of palm oil on white cloth. And again, I'm really trying with Odu, for anybody that's listening, to stick to published sources and not go too much into permutations, just because I would like to keep my religious privileges. But the elder who broke the palm oil keg, that is Obatala, he who by covering it all made it all right. It is starting a war and inner struggle that goes on in the backyard of the skull, which is the sacred home of Iponri, the secret home of Iponri that is cast for she who gave him nightly favors, the concubine in the king's palace. Like, Ifa verses are their own extreme, interesting. Odu is the poetry of it is almost inaccessible from a Western lens unless you really know what it's trying to say and understanding the poetry. But there is the hidden side here, the things at the back of the skull, the things that need to be attended, that kind of reptile brain that is always on watch.
Right.
It always needs to kick in when you hear the things falling in the woods around you so that you wake up and take care of it. There's a victory and an accomplishment that comes here, but there's also an easy betrayal by friends, easy betrayal by people you consider close. They're not going to give you good advice. They're trying to to take the resources for themselves. You can't. Sometimes they say you can't tie water in a knot, or that you can't tie water to your clothes. You can make them wet, but you can't tie water to it.
Right.
But yeah.
Interesting
Stuff there. It's also one of those ones that, because it's so high up, it's not one that's talked about quite as much. It's outside the bell curve of De Lagoon, the ones in the center, the bell curve there. But as far as if you're in E5, remember that E5 is throwing Okwele, so it's far less the devices themselves, the average, the statistics change what shows up. But there's metaphysical understandings of why that is. But just for clarity's sake, geomantically, can it be a judge?
No, it cannot, because it has 7 points. So owing to the maths of laying out your mother figures and your daughter figures on the same lines, you have 8 of them that then are added together to produce the nieces, the 4 nieces, and then added together to produce the 2 witnesses, and then those 2 witnesses are added together to produce the 1 judge. Because of the layers of iteration there, in a properly cast shield chart, there can only be 8 of the 16 figures can be judges, and those 8 are the 8 with an even number of points. So Via as 1, 1, 1, 1, 4 points total is fine. Populus as 8 points total is fine. Albus as 7 points total is not fine. It can't be a judge, and therefore can't be a true court configuration. But I think it's still useful for us to look at the various combinations, the triads, we might say, the non-court configurations that can produce Albus. So, for instance, we talked of, say, Pua, the young boy, sets out on a road via to wisdom. Would be Pua moving to Via produces Albus, for instance. So I still think those triads and combinations are worth considering.
It's fascinating. It made me think about, because of, not that there's an immediate correspondence here between the higher ups and the ones that can't be judges, because the judges don't exist the same way. There is in Ifa a compound that also has 2 witnesses always. There's always those the primary followed by 2. So the
and this is also ancestral, right? It's mirroring Ashida and Aquada.
Yes, it's mirroring the because this is all tied up into the mythology, right? So Ella cannot manifest on the earth in one person. Wisdom cannot be the property of one person. It cannot manifest the same way that the other Orishas manifest. So it first comes to the earth and becomes the ocean. And then at some point, Ella figures out how to manifest, which is through a teacher who must teach. So a teacher, in order to teach, must have someone to teach. There's a lot of variances of homophonic twos in that sentence. In order to teach, the teacher must have 2 people to teach, if you're Ifa specifically, in that they pair off. So the initiation transference there happens, which speaks of the twinning right there. And the twin legs of the 2 legs of each Odu, which is always two of the signs, whether it's mirrored or compound. So there's a mystery in that itself there too, but it reflects the nature of transmission, that just like the notions of Kabbalistic training, that if all you know is this one thing, then you transmit that one thing. And that person could then add to it. But tracing the lineage in that way is always that thing. So the first students become paired up in the legs, the things that the thing stands on, or else it doesn't move. So that is a critique, or at least a slight modification of the geomancy, in the sense that it must have 2 sides in order to be thriving. So that means there's a minimum of 6 figures represented in the 3 figures at the end of an Ifa reading, because they're compound, and they can be anything because they're independently derived. They're derived at the same time. So that's all mechanics to think about that is fascinating as far as like how the figures are derived, in that they're developed across the lines compoundly. So the figure is not one figure derived and then followed by another figure, which would be similar to how De Lagoon represents its throws, one throw followed by another, but rather it's independently derived. So you would do all of the top line dots first, which could go anywhere from 2 to 4.
Right.
So it's just slightly changes things, but the idea that what fascinated me about knowing that it's not a judge possibility, in that it's informing the outcome, but it can't be the outcome, which is fascinating in the sense that like it immediately has to take a back seat a little bit. It's never going to be as pushy as some of the others.
Yeah. It's an advisor. It can't be the king of the chart. There's a lovely exception as well. I do want to get onto our girl Isobel, but there's a lovely exception in Albus Moors in the White in the 8th house, which Catan says that it is it's good for everything, good for all demands of this house, except for nigromancy and the diabolical art, in which it is ill, unless, so there's an exception to the exception, unless it be to make men sing and dance. And this one is still of great interest to me. I've been pondering it for a while. Albus is not terribly known for its singing and dancing. It's rather more known for its scholarship and its love of books and of quiet and of libraries. And so there's an interesting set of factors here. On the one hand, a lot of the diabolical art is said to be contained in books of darkness. On the other hand, that you would do such a thing in order to make men sing and dance is not is playing against obvious type of Albus. And so I'm interested in trying to nuance what's going on there. Albus isn't emotionless. It's very hopeful and very amiable and wants to make friends, but it may be a little socially awkward. But that awkwardness isn't, I don't know what to say. It feels more like a feeling you've made a friend just because you've nerded out about the same thing.
Yes, in many ways, I would say it's quite the opposite. That this is an extremely emotional and volatile sign that is bathing itself in has to bathe itself in discipline, or it will destroy things. That again, you are. If we take the lovely Christian parallel here, it is outspilled blood. It is blood outside of its normal veins, but still contained in a religious ritual of discipline that is the chalice.
Oh.
It does not belong outside the body, but it's still contained. It's not spilled like Rubius, but it's still spilled. And so, the nature here that the things speak of is that, you have friends, but they're not true. You have passions, but you don't know how to tame them with advantage outside your own. If someone said no to you that you were attracted to, it's the end of the world. In this sign, it feels things very intensely. It's like, it's solar Scorpios.
Shit.
But oftentimes when we get to these things, it's always going to be like the call to discipline, the call to reflection. What is that going to be? Somebody, you want to have multiple options, a backup plan. Always have a backup plan in this sign. Always. You do not invest all your eggs in one basket. The soldier does not send all of his soldiers to war. This is imperative in this.
How do we get from that to Gowdie?
Well, her whole coven didn't go to confess. I do, we might as well just freaking talk about Gowdie because we've been talking about her spattering of it as it is. Right. But, Gowdie's kind of just such a fascinating figure, because the series of testimonies that are there give so much colorful description that plays into the existing witch mythology that was being proposed by the propaganda machines, and then kind of even takes it one step further. So Gowdie, for those that don't know her, over a course of 6 weeks in April, goes into a Scottish judge hall and talks about meeting the devil, and here's how I turn into a hare. And the famous, I shall go into a hare with sorrow and such and mickle care, and I shall go in the devil's name till I come home again. Hare, hare, I send thee care. I am in hare's likeness now, but I shall be in a woman's likeness even now.
Not just meeting the devil, but having sex with him.
Having sex with him, transforming the formulas of what it is. The understanding that she renounced her baptism, that the devil's mark was put on her shoulder, and blood could be sucked from it. That she, the coven had 13 members. This is a heavy source of what Murray used, and Gardner and Valiente capitalized on, to propose a universality to this romantic fertility neo-paganism that was booming. That the brooms were laid beside the husband in bed, so that the husband wouldn't notice she was absent. That the coven rode through the air on magical horses and entered through the windows. That the Queen of the Fairies, the Queen of Elfame, specifically of Downey Hill, was entertaining them, and that there were water bowls and everything. Clay effigies of the leader of the sire of a manor, so that sickness and death could be invoked. Transforming into animals like cats and hares, and
it's about like the elf shot stuff as well.
The elf shot stuff, but notice where they went with cats and hares. To the house of one Alexander Cummings.
Yes. Who isn't really talked about a lot other than that, but yeah.
No, but yeah. Someday we're just going to put little hair poops outside your front door just to freak you out.
Not to be confused with the 18th century Scottish Alexander Cumming, who was a watchmaker who patented the first flushing toilet in around 1770.
That's a load of crap.
Yeah. But the Cumming and the Cummings and the Cummingses were at war with each other as well across the clan wars of Robert the Bruce.
Well, thank God for the Stuart War and killing all the Highland culture off.
Right.
Just ending the Cummingses' war with themselves. Yeah. Okay. So the thing with Gowdie's confessions that are super important is that they're not extracted under torture. There are some that propose that they were, but she herself, she is not a young woman. She's describing things that happened like over a decade and a half or 2 decades. And
in 1662.
Yeah.
Right.
She walks in and just says this. And then we don't have record of what happened to her, and many people treat this as mysterious. Of course, all of this turns on its head. All research of Isobel Gowdie is you can't discuss her now without talking about Emma Wilby. And
right.
This is the quintessential and important exploration of this to really, as an apologist, but not without founding. Like, it's to understand that maybe there's something here in this, not in a Murrayist way, but in the same vein of let's look at this for what it contains.
Yeah. There's a lot you can say about Wilby's treatment of Gowdie, and a lot that should be said, and a lot of it's really good. Also, just like without even getting into interpretation of a thesis, like it's worth pointing out that while there was access to a lot of this material second and third hand, the actual confessions were believed to have been lost when Wilby started the work, and she rediscovered them in an uncatalogued box of papers in the National Archives. Like, so it's worth pointing out that like she literally like brought her back into the light. I mean, obviously she'd influenced these, you know, that lineage of witchcraft writers that you pointed out. But like we can't not say that to start with. And I think Wilby's, you know, rightly pointing out that we definitely need, you know, her focus is seen to be so often on Gowdie, and it is, but it's also on John Innes, right? Innes, however that surname said, the clerk, who is not only, it seems, characteristically generous, like in terms of, you know, letting her carry on about things that might not be super relevant to the thing they're talking about, but also seems to have this, like, it seems to be a very
like at all.
Hmm?
We don't know what that's like at all.
No idea. But no, he seems to really relish getting into the cosmology of like, and what does the devil do about this? You know, he really, like, they set up the perfect storm of being able to talk about what's going on here, and that kind of adds to the complexity in that maybe if there had been more clerks like John, then we would have more confessions like Isobel's.
And there is a lot of interpretation of. I think Wilby was the one that was talking about it as a I don't want to say fantastical escapist, but fantasy response to the trauma of rape. Was part of her thesis in the description of the devil's prick and everything. But Diane Purkis, who I just recently started reading At the Bottom of the Garden, Ursvet's recommendation. But Purkis was really into the meal aspect, that there's so much description of food and feasting in the Confessions.
Right.
That it describes someone who's suffering from malnourishment, and there's this side of it, and of course that immediately allows people to discuss things like ergotism and similar things. But there's some good meat in this. This is one of the sources of, because it's internally coherent for herself, of course. But
well, this is the root. Sorry, this is the root issue of Wilby's thesis. It rests on the fact that Gowdie actually like self-identifies as a practitioner of harmful magic, right? And through these dreams and visions, Isobel experiences communion with spirits and fairies, and communion with other dream cult members, and participation in these harmful self-defensive magics, right? And that's worth pointing out as well. It is full maleficia, but it's not done just because, right?
And I mean, Scots love telling stories, and there's a captive audience, and it's its own side of that too. I mean, all those things are factors in it. Right. And this have been discussed by many of the scholars in this kind of revivalism of Gowdie, especially post Wilby, to the point where that was the subject of the conference, the inspiration for the conference. Last year in Cornwall.
I was reading a review by Paul Jenkins, and he was just foregrounding like that this is a significant factor, that like he said, you know, the argument that Isobel may have actually performed harmful ritual magic and real acts of maleficium is totally contrary to orthodox. He's talking about like historians' thinking on the subject, which tends to see it as something that was attributed to certain individuals rather than something that was actually performed. And yes, you do find the witch at the end of a pointed finger. It is a political act. But the idea that no one thought they were doing this stuff, everyone thought it was someone else. Like, it highlights that, as Wilby argues, to assume that there was nothing real at the root of these fears, that for 300 years Europe was fixated on the identification and elimination of an entirely imaginary crime, is, Jenkins says, a hasty and rather condescending presumption, which is fucking brilliant, right? Like, yes, we need to talk about why people would resort to witchcraft or resort to witchcraft accusations, but to argue that it's all labeling theory and there's no one like self-identifying as a witch seems bonkers.
Well, and by that extension, then you're talking about what could in many ways be, even if she's not doing all these things in actuality, But this is the impulse then for what is now considered traditional witchcraft.
Yeah.
In looking at the concepts of the witch trials and treating them as fact and inspiration for practice. And even so much as where in a lot of traditional craft, it is not to seek the technology that it may have been, but the technology that allows it to be interpreted as witchcraft. Because that is the modus, right? We want the ointment, the flying ointment. We don't want to talk of just herbal preparations and salves and things like this that might be from the healer's side, but literally like, I want the flying ointment that sends me through the chimney, the witch's ointment, the witch's mark, referring to the deities of nature that may, or masking traditions of, come on, and any winter guising study, Violet Alford's Animal Masks of Europe. It's such a great book, but like the Osir, the various wild men that are across Europe in the mountainous regions that are horned. It doesn't, you can propose that masks are an easy part of any of this. All of these things are, traditional craft is born from trying to treat those records as fact, or at least as an inspiration from which to build from, as opposed to a lot of what happens, interestingly, in my opinion, in the grimoire traditions that we're seeing, is that we want to keep finding the texts, right? Go back further and further to before Christianity, which I have my thoughts about that with Protestantism and England. Once you've rebelled against the Mother Church, then you don't need Christianity at all. Whereas in the Catholic parts of the world, it wasn't. We talked about this with Catarina, but like, if you're Catholic, you never rebelled against Mother Church, and everything just gets interpreted through, putting it into a Catholic universe, and it's a very different thing. It wasn't too long ago where it was still arguing that there was no true witchcraft in Catholic or Christian countries in the same way, and it's like, we can argue the opposite. That's exactly where it exists, because that's the Ashtaroth demon is sitting there staring and making you lazy.
Right. And I think that kind of does hit the nail on the head in terms of like looking at, in terms of how how witches approach history, which at times can feel a little like Peter has that like a wonderful line about how a lot of anthropologists approach magic like stereotypical straight men about lesbian porn, right? They love the idea of projecting themselves into it, but they don't actually want to deal with the reality of the thing.
It was like when you went to the academic conference, they were like, "Wait, you actually do this? You actually?"
Oh yeah. That's fully like people at best edging away from you, if not outright calling you insane to your face, and making fun of you,
and
asking
thus your love of Jonathan Strange.
Oh god, yeah. I can see that story from every angle of every character in it. So this becomes the difficulty when which is also some of the, I think, very legitimate criticisms that have been leveled at, or at least provisos of things to bear in mind about Wilby's treatment. That this, the classic critique is like, using evidence from like modern Brazil to talk about 17th century Scotland might sort of exacerbate the lack of direct evidence rather than remedying it. One reviewer was like, the book kind of leaves the reader unsure as to how Native American belief might reflect magical practices in Scotland, right?
She's only following what has been done since the neo-pagan revival.
Oh, for sure. And there's plenty of other anthropologists and historians who are doing this as well. Polk's argument that, not Runyon, P-O with a dash over it, C-S. Ava Polk's argument that in the Western European witch trials, that the demonic pact might have something to do with the notion of shamanistic helping spirits. Like, it's not... she's in a fine tradition here, and she's filling in the pieces with other pieces, and that's that's a set of
it's hopefully scaffolding for the possibility that your hope of what this might be can be filled in later when we find more evidence that actually supports from it within the structure.
Exactly. I read a great
the possibility first.
Exactly, and that's what it's doing. And when you do that, that's wonderful, because that opens up our options, and that nuances discussion and discourse. When you start treating those suppositions as fact, as a firm, solid ground on which to build further suppositions, then you're outside of the realm of like being fair to your historical subjects at that point.
Absolutely. And just, to reiterate, it's certainly, when I say it's already been done, I mean, I was just talking about this with Langston, and it's an ongoing conversation that I would love to do. I wonder if it's even possible to decolonize Western witchcraft at this point. From what it does, because witchcraft by its nature, as we explore it now, is about appropriating power, but in that, so many other things get appropriated.
Right.
And there's this constant filling in, especially with black and brown and red and yellow magic. Use all of the things. All the races of mankind are, if England conquered the world looking for spices for good food, then English magic conquered. I'm not making you a representative of English magic, but the Anglo-American inheritance of magic seems to have conquered the world to try and justify its conceptions of Anglo-English American magic. And we come across this in cycles all the time, right? Like that using shamanism to validate and describe everything has now given way to using animism, which is a more accurate reflection. It's been refined. It does feel like the pendulum is swinging back and forth towards something that's a little more accurate. And certainly also it's worth pointing out that, like, just because she uses that word doesn't mean that she gets to be shoved into a box of like Eliad fanboys who aren't relevant anymore. She's an incredible responsible scholar, and I mean,
and the stuff specifically on anthropological scholarship around shamanism is around the phenomena of, quote, dark shamanism specifically. It was a direct deliberate intervention on noticing anthropoligists' tendencies to romanticize and talk about the great intellect and integrity of shamans. And so to talk about assault sorcery and ritual predation and ecstatic violence, like, that's really important. That needs to be looked at. That's addressing, that's not playing into a lazy trope or stereotype or fantasist thinking. That's trying to rescue it from that.
Oh, it's like the West's obsession to call Buddhism a philosophy instead of a religion.
Right. Right.
To exhibit Hinduism as one specific view, as espoused by British colonials, and that's its own thing. That's a lifetime of me having the same thoughts over and over.
And I mean, especially when you're into the history of this and the drawing out what can and can't, usefully, and again, the modal verbs of can't as in not able to, or can't as in not allowed to. I don't know. I think I really liked what Sierra Rose Dye says about Gowdie. Says about the treatment of Gowdie in Wilby's work. So on the one hand, she, like, this total shade. At times, the line between hypothesis based on factual evidence and conjecture born of fancy seems to have been blurred, if not blatantly crossed, which is like, whoo, ruthless. But on the other hand, she says the significance of Wilby's project lies in its reminder to scholars and novices alike that, for some people, witchcraft could indeed represent a lived experience. In emphasizing the subjective nature of visionary experience, Wilby points out that while alleged witches might not have actually flown to diabolical Sabbaths on wisps of straw, they might have experienced something similar through dreams and visions of flying, astral projection, and spiritual transformation. And here's crucially the not colonizing our own ancestors point. In making such an argument, Wilby restores agency and vitality to those individuals who are so often portrayed as the passive victims of a state or patriarchy-driven witch hunt, and offers significant contribution to the field of witchcraft studies. And I really like that we aren't painting our I say our in the broad sense. We aren't painting these forebears, these witch foremothers, either as exactly what it happens that we want in the 21st century a traditional witchcraft TM to look like, but that we're also acknowledging that they're complicated and there's things we don't know about them, and we're not painting them into a corner or limiting the strangeness of their actuality.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and we can complain about the need to where Wilby doesn't cross the line. She's not using Kanayama dark shamanism as a validation of anything or a way to prove that Gowdie was doing something.
Right.
What she's doing it is to break the supposition that she wasn't doing anything. She's using it to expand and break the box so that the question can be asked and further developed in the future, which is a very different reasoning to compare. It's kind of like in the justification in Pichardo versus the city of Hialeah when Santeria was getting defended in the Supreme Court. The constant need for people to look to biblical blood sacrifice as justification for why animal sacrifice might have to happen in another tradition. And I understand the impulse there because it's Judeo-Christianity, but you're not going to get that into a Christian's head as to it because of Hebrews chapter 9, Jesus defeats the need to kill animals to God. And because without a temple-based system, you only have the Samaritans offering blood because they believe it's a different temple mount. So it becomes this different thing. And also, why do you need to justify one religious tradition with another?
Yeah,
and,
well, that's the main point there, right?
Yeah, and that's what's going into it, is that there's a difference in comparing it. And we get into this when we would describe anything. It's the errors in translation, which is a constant theme throughout all of this, and it's certainly an exploration of mine. If I ask you what you mean by a word and I've never heard it before, and you start telling me other words, or you could just show me the thing and I'll form my own opinions of what it is, I'm going to immediately interpret it through what I know and not what you might have attached to it. And those things change. So Wilby has been approached in a certain way for so long that it doesn't allow anything new. And so to bring in these outside sources is a way of actually not appropriation justification, but actually to expand the conceptions, because it wasn't getting different from examining under the same lens. So I find that parallel with, like, if we really look to this as like a foreshadowing of what is now considered traditional witchcraft, folkloric witchcraft, as there's something there in looking to this as she played into it. She either believed it or told the stories. We don't know if she was executed or not. Most people write down who was executed all the time.
By the way, that's not unusual. No time for Shakespeare conspiracy about how weird it is that we only have one document where he signed his name or whatever it is. That's not weird. That's standard for the period. It's
interesting because they say that there was 13 members in the coven, right? And that 41 people were arrested as a result of the Redhead and Gowdie's testimonies, which was like, but that's so much more than 13 times 2.
Well, it's it's a contagion, right? It's a spiritual sickness that takes many it touches, etc. I think the instance of the Hylia and the idea of like trying to make one religion, trying to prove something or deny something to one religion based off another, is also an opportunity for us to think about syncretism again, and the difference between top down and bottom up. Of like, we're not talking just because a lot of Santeras might, with no duplicity, consider themselves Catholic. As well, you just because that you can't then impose from a state level down with the threat of police and incarceration and guns and what have you. Never mind, state capital punishment. You can't then say, okay, we have to engage in this like theological apologetics.
Yeah, I mean, explaining yourself to an authority that's so integrally tied into the system of oppression and cultural dominance of a specific religious tradition, it makes sense why you would pull from what you can see. That's like the devil knowing the Bible better than a preacher.
Right.
Like know your enemy. But that's a tactic as opposed to
exactly.
there comes a point where you shouldn't have to justify. No one owes that explanation there, which is also part of a Western dialectic, right? If you can ask the question, then you should have the answer, which is just not a modality that exists in everywhere in the world. But certainly makes for fascinating conflicts. Yeah.
Quite so.
What that is, the rationalized philosophies still come steps in there through Ashtaroth there. Fascinating.
Naturally.
And if Bartholomew is the one that can cut off that tendency that like the flaying knife is like, you start to go, but, and then he just chops it off and says, no, no, but, except what was just told to you. Stop. And here we have these things that Mandrake that leads you out in like it increases the heat of your body past your skin. It's warming, right? So the heat escapes in that way. And quartz, it expands and it can trap, but it's interesting that its name by its nature is exceptionally cold. It's so cold that it's frozen, but it still is the thing that can like focus a laser beam, right? It's an interesting factor there. And to night flight, the parallel to Mandrake, of course, Mandrake can be used in ointments for that, but that like leaving the body without leaving the body is interesting. Albus and
traveling without moving.
Traveling without moving, yes. The most precious substance in this world is time. Also, that with Albus, if we think about it, or at least from the Oturupon side, that a soldier does not send all his soldiers into battle. You're still retaining something. The body is there, but some soldiers are going off to the Sabbath. It's fascinating. And that the moon, in its the relationship between the luminaries and their light, the tidal forces, everything aligning to the moon, but the moon can disappear completely and come back, there's something interesting to there, that even the shape-shifting side of Gowdie and all these things.
That it's contained, and also the thing that it's the container, and also the thing that's contained as well, like skin. It's a connector and a container, a portal and a place.
The lock and the key, as we like to say.
And then Isobel standing there, kind of bringing a lot of this together, these themes and concepts down in a set of confessions.
The threading of it all is a wonderful. I'm very happy with the Connect Four. But I will say that we are definitely a long show this time.
We are indeed.
And so welcome back. It's the first show of this calendar year. It has been an exceptionally long March.
Indeed. It's been a hell of a year, this March. Yeah.
Exactly. So I wish everyone good health and good spirits. Stay safe. Stay sane. Be good to the people you are in quarantine with, whether you are by yourself or with others. And bathe in the moonlight as best you can. May that be don't send all your soldiers into battle. Don't let your emotions get taken over. But do drink as much Mandrake wine as you can get your hands on. Right. Have sex with the devil. He's great.
He does that thing with its tongue you like.
Yeah. And then and don't eat anything except Jesus.
Right. Yeah, nothing but Jesus. And if you can put your finger through his foreskin, then why wouldn't you?
We always invite you to check out the Radio Free Golgotha Facebook page and our group, Folk Necromancy, which is generally pretty active and has quite a few members and a lot of posts coming out on relevant topics, as well as Al's classes, some of which are hosted through my store, Wolf and Goat. And we'll keep prowling ahead into the future and contradicting ourselves at every turn
just for rationalization practice.
Just to give Ashtaroth something to do, to feel accomplished.
I will remember this and use it in my rationalization.
Yes, exactly. if we rationalize so much that Ashtaroth just gets fat and can't move, we've actually done a blessing for the world.
There we go.
It's our mitzvah.
So selfless.
Yes, absolutely. The most humblest. So, dear humble friends, thank you so much for joining us, and we will put another one out very soon. We have a few guests lined up, and we're excited about those things. So, any last profound thoughts? As
Thuggets. Yep, it's definitely pronounced Thuggets. Yep. Not especially, I don't think. No, I'm not going to try and force it. If poetry come not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, etc. Thank you all so much for coming on this night flight through white and lunar and witchy mysteries. Thanks, everyone. Good to be back. Good to be doing it again.
All right, thank you. In the mirror I saw her. Astaroth. Whoa!
Cast that circle, dude.
So,
Oh, bless.